Today we're diving into one of the most haunting mysteries in Ark Raiders lore, the buried city in Italy that vanished beneath an impossible desert. And I've pieced together every fragment of information to show you what really went down there. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Look, I've been combing through Ark Raiders lore for months now, and the buried city kept coming up in scattered terminal entries, environmental storytelling, and background chatter. So I decided to put together this deep dive, focusing specifically on Italy's transformation and the city that got swallowed. I had to make some tough calls about what to include, since the game gives us pieces, not a complete picture. I chose to emphasize the environmental collapse and human response over the mechanical architect details, because that's where the real tragedy lives. Some of the timeline is speculation based on context clues, and I've reordered certain events to make the narrative flow chronologically rather than how you'd encounter them in-game. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Warning Signs. The buried city didn't disappear overnight. Evidence suggests the environmental changes started years before the final collapse, but nobody connected the dots until it was too late. Satellite imagery from the early Ark invasion period shows slight discoloration in the soil patterns around what's now the desert perimeter. The Italian Agricultural Ministry filed reports about crops dying in concentric circles spreading outward from a central point near the city. Farmers complained that their irrigation systems would run dry within hours of filling. The water just vanished into the ground, like the earth itself had become impossibly thirsty. Local geologists investigated, but their equipment kept malfunctioning. Temperature readings made no sense. The ground was simultaneously too hot and too cold, depending on which instrument you used. What's interesting here is that the civilian government treated this as a localized agricultural crisis. They sent aid packages and farming subsidies. They didn't send military reconnaissance. The Ark machines had already established a presence in the region, but they weren't the obvious aggressive kind. These were the quiet ones, the ones that burrowed, the ones that observers might mistake for mining equipment if they didn't look too closely. Intelligence reports from that period, the ones you can still access in partially corrupted databanks, mention unidentified mechanical structures but classify them as low priority. The focus was on the big walkers, the destroyer-class machines that leveled cities in hours. Nobody was watching the slow burn. The city itself, we'll call it by its placeholder designation, since the actual name got scrubbed from most records, was a mid-sized urban centre. Not Rome or Milan, but significant enough. Around 200,000 residents. A mixture of historical architecture and modern expansion, the kind of place where thousand-year-old churches sat next to glass office buildings. When the ground started changing, people noticed, but they adapted. Humans are good at adapting. They drilled deeper wells, they imported water, they reinforced foundations as buildings started settling unevenly. One resident's journal, recovered from the edge of what became the desert, talks about how everyone just accepted it as the new normal. Infrastructure problems, climate change. Bad luck, nobody said the word invasion. The temperature shifts came next. Summer heat that lingered into October, then November, then December. The Mediterranean climate that had defined the region for millennia just stopped working. Meteorologists couldn't explain it. Their models didn't account for a localized heat zone that ignored prevailing wind patterns. The heat came from below. Thermal imaging shows the ground itself was radiating warmth in geometric patterns, not natural geological activity, something artificial, something designed. But the data was fragmented, and nobody had the full picture. Each agency had one piece of the puzzle, and they weren't talking to each other. By the time someone suggested evacuation, the roads were already compromised. The asphalt had started breaking down. Not cracking from heat, but actually decomposing at a molecular level. Chemical analysis of the road surface showed impossible results. The petroleum-based materials were reverting to component elements, breaking apart. One engineer described it as watching fast-forward decay, a process that should take centuries happening in weeks. Vehicles that tried to leave found their tires melting, not from heat, but from contact with the road itself. The path out was closing. The civilian population started to panic around this point. Social media posts from those final weeks show a progression from confusion to fear to desperation. People couldn't leave by car. The train lines had buckled. The airport's runway had developed sinkholes. Someone suggested walking out, but the heat was intensifying. Daytime temperatures were hitting 50 degrees Celsius. Nighttime barely dropped to 40. Humans can't sustain that. Not without specialized equipment, not for the distances they'd need to cover. The city was becoming a prison with invisible walls made of heat and crumbling infrastructure. Military response was delayed. The Italian armed forces were stretched thin dealing with arc incursions across multiple fronts. By the time they mobilized a rescue operation, the perimeter had become genuinely dangerous. Helicopters could fly in, but landing was problematic. The heat created unpredictable updrafts. Dust storms had started forming, even though there was no desert yet. Just dust, rising from the decomposing infrastructure, from the breaking down of everything humanity had built. The rescue operation managed to extract maybe 30,000 people, a fraction of the total population. The rest either couldn't reach the extraction points or wouldn't leave. Some people refused to abandon their homes, even when the walls were literally turning to powder. The military documentation from the evacuation is clinical. Casualty estimates, resource allocation, strategic withdrawal. But between the lines, you can read the desperation. Soldiers reporting that civilians were suffering from heat stroke in the shade, medical supplies running out, water rations insufficient, and underneath it all, the sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the physics of the situation. One officer's report mentions that compasses stopped working inside the affected zone. Magnetic north would drift. Electronic devices would fail without apparent cause. It was like the laws of nature were being rewritten in real time. The final evacuations happened under increasingly surreal conditions. Witnesses described the sky turning colors that shouldn't exist. Not sunset orange or storm gray, but shades that human language doesn't have words for. The light itself felt wrong. Photographers who tried to document it found their images came out distorted. Colors shifted in the digital files. Some photos showed structures that weren't there when the picture was taken, or showed empty space where buildings definitely stood. Reality was becoming unreliable. Communication with the outside world became intermittent. Cell towers were still standing, but signals would cut out randomly. Internet connections would work for minutes, then fail for hours. The last verified social media post from inside the city is time-stamped 3 days before the final collapse. It's a video, shaky phone camera footage of an empty street. The buildings are still there, but they look faded, like old photographs, like they're becoming less real. The person filming doesn't speak. They just pan across the scene, and then the video cuts off. Nobody knows what happened to them. The government declared the city a total loss and established a quarantine perimeter, military checkpoints, no entry authorization. The official story was environmental catastrophe, unexplained geological event. They didn't mention the arc machines because they weren't supposed to be there. The ones that had been spotted were classified as monitoring equipment, not a threat, not an invasion force. That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. But at the time, it was easier to blame nature than admit that humanity had no idea what was actually happening. Scientists who studied the perimeter reported increasingly bizarre findings. The soil composition was changing, becoming more like sand, but not natural sand, manufactured sand. Each grain perfectly uniform. The heat signatures suggested massive energy expenditure happening underground. Something was converting the earth itself into something else. The process was methodical, spreading outward from the city center in measured increments, like a computer program executing instructions. Transform this area, then the next, then the next. Patient and relentless. Religious leaders offered various interpretations. Divine punishment, end times prophecy, spiritual corruption made manifest. The Vatican issued statements calling for prayer and humanitarian aid. They avoided specifics about what they thought was happening. Some local clergy who had remained in the city sent desperate messages talking about visions, about seeing the machines in dreams before they ever appeared in reality, about the ground having a hunger. These messages were dismissed as heat-induced delirium, but they kept coming until the communication blackout. International response was limited. Other nations were dealing with their own Ark invasions. Resources were scarce. Attention was divided. The buried city became a footnote in the larger global crisis, just one more catastrophe in a world full of them. Aid organizations tried to help, but they couldn't reach the affected area. The quarantine was absolute. Anyone who tried to cross the perimeter reported immediate physical distress. Nausea, disorientation, equipment failure. It was like the zone itself rejected outside intervention. The media coverage followed a predictable arc: initial shock, extensive reporting, then fatigue, then silence. People stopped talking about it because there was nothing new to say. The city was gone, the people were dead or displaced. The cause was unknown. Move on to the next crisis. But the survivors couldn't move on. The refugees from the buried city scattered across Europe. They carried trauma that nobody else could understand. They talked about the heat, about the wrongness, about watching their world unmake itself, and nobody believed the parts that sounded impossible. Underground networks started sharing conspiracy theories. Government weapons tests gone wrong. Alien invasion. None of them were quite right, but they were closer than the official explanations, because the truth was that humanity didn't have a framework for understanding what was happening. The Ark machines operated on principles that broke human understanding of physics. They weren't just technology, they were something that made technology look primitive, and the buried city was one of their experiments. The quarantine zone expanded slowly over the following months. The military kept pushing the perimeter back as the affected area grew. Each retreat meant abandoning more territory, more towns, more agricultural land. The Italian government tried to contain the information, but satellite imagery was publicly available. People could see the desert spreading, could see the unnatural geometry of its expansion, could see that this wasn't a normal environmental disaster. This was something else, something that suggested intelligence behind the destruction. The last official updates before the information blackout mentioned that the city centre had completely vanished beneath sand dunes. Dunes that formed in weeks instead of centuries. Dunes that sat in perfect mathematical arrangements. The desert had arrived, not through climate change or natural processes, through design, through intention, and somewhere under that sand, buried deep, the city waited. Not destroyed, not exactly. Transformed. Changed into something that served a purpose humanity couldn't yet comprehend. What the authorities didn't tell anyone was that the expansion had stopped. The desert reached a specific boundary and went no further. Like it had accomplished a goal, like the transformation had a defined objective, and once that objective was met, the process halted. That suggests intentionality. That suggests the buried city wasn't a casualty of the Ark invasion. It was a project. And if it was a project, then it had a purpose. Understanding that purpose would become an obsession for the resistance forces. Because if you could understand what the Ark machines wanted, maybe you could stop them. Maybe you could reverse what they'd done. Maybe you could save the people who were still down there. Because that was the awful possibility that nobody wanted to voice. That they weren't dead. That being buried didn't mean being killed. That something worse might be happening in the dark, beneath the sand. Chapter 2. The Desert Formation. The speed of the desert's formation violated every principle of geological science. Desertification is supposed to take decades or centuries. This took weeks. The sand appeared to generate from the ground itself, not blown in from somewhere else, not the result of erosion. Created, manufactured. Each grain identical to the next. Under microscopic analysis, the composition was Earth-standard silica, but the formation process was anything but natural. Scientists who examined samples before the full information blackout reported that the sand grains showed evidence of having been assembled at the molecular level, not weathered, not broken down from larger rocks, built, constructed like tiny machines themselves. The color of the sand was wrong too. Desert sand comes in various shades depending on mineral content. This sand was uniform, a pale grey that didn't match anything in the surrounding region. It didn't reflect light the way natural sand does. Instead, it seemed to absorb it. Photographers complained that their cameras couldn't properly expose images of the desert. The sand would come out either blown out white or murky grey depending on the settings. Like it existed in a different relationship to light than normal matter. Some speculated the sand had optical properties that human eyes and cameras weren't equipped to properly interpret. Temperature measurements within the desert showed inconsistencies that made no scientific sense. The surface would be scorching hot, 50 or 60 degrees Celsius, but dig down half a meter and the temperature would drop to nearly freezing. Then deeper still it would spike again. The thermal layers didn't correspond to any known geological activity. They formed patterns, waves, like the heat itself was being controlled. Being directed for a specific purpose, thermal imaging from aircraft showed geometric shapes in the temperature distribution. Circles, hexagons, straight lines that stretched for kilometers. The desert wasn't random. It was designed. Wind patterns over the desert defied meteorological prediction. Storms would form and dissipate according to no natural schedule. Dust devils would appear in perfectly still air. Sand would blow upward instead of being driven along the ground. Weather services gave up trying to forecast conditions over the affected area because the data made no sense. Multiple observation stations would report contradictory readings at the same timestamp. One would measure calm conditions, while another 2 kilometers away recorded hurricane-force winds. The desert created its own weather, or the weather was being created for it. The few drone surveys that managed to penetrate deep into the desert before technical failures sent back disturbing imagery. The sand dunes weren't random formations shaped by wind. They were uniform, identical, repeating in precise mathematical intervals, like rows in a factory, like the output of a manufacturing process. Each dune was approximately 40 meters from peak to trough. Each had the same slope angle, the same orientation. Natural dunes don't behave that way. Natural dunes are chaotic, shaped by variable wind and shifting sand. These dunes were as artificial as a brick wall. Below the surface, ground-penetrating radar revealed cavities, vast empty spaces where the city should be, but the spaces were too regular, too organized. The scan data showed what looked like tunnels, chambers, networks of passages that connected in ways that suggested planning, suggested architecture. The city hadn't been crushed by the weight of sand. It had been incorporated into something else, something that used the existing structures as components, as raw materials for a larger construction. The buildings were still there, just not in any form their original inhabitants would recognize. Seismic sensors placed around the perimeter picked up regular vibrations, not earthquakes, not the random rumble of tectonic movement. Pulses, rhythmic, coming at precise intervals. Some scientists suggested it was machinery, enormous engines running under the sand. But the energy output required for machinery on that scale would be astronomical, would require power sources that shouldn't exist. Others suggested the pulses were communication, that the desert was broadcasting, sending signals deep into the earth or out into space, that the buried city had become a transmitter for messages humans couldn't decode. The edge of the desert was sharp, unnaturally sharp. You could stand with 1 foot on normal Italian soil and 1 foot on the grey sand. The transition was immediate. No gradual blending, no mixing of sand and dirt. Just a hard line where one environment stopped and another began. That border stayed stable once the expansion halted. Meters were placed to detect any movement, but the line remained fixed, like the desert had reached its intended size and decided to grow no further. That restraint suggested control, suggested that something was managing the process, making decisions about how far to spread and when to stop. Plant life along the border died immediately upon touching the sand. Grass would wither, trees would drop leaves, roots would rot. But the death wasn't from heat or lack of water. Chemical analysis showed the plant tissues had been broken down at the cellular level, dismantled. The sand didn't just kill vegetation, it deconstructed it, reduced it to component molecules. Some theorized the sand was consuming organic matter for raw materials, using the carbon and nitrogen and other elements to fuel whatever process was happening underground. The desert was eating the world and using what it ate to build something new. Animals avoided the desert entirely. Birds wouldn't fly over it. Insects wouldn't cross the border. Even microbes in the soil showed population drops near the edge. Life recognized something wrong about the sand and stayed away. Only humans were stupid enough or desperate enough to try entering. The few attempts at ground exploration ended badly. Research teams would cross the border and their equipment would fail within minutes. Communications would cut out. GPS would malfunction. Teams that managed to retreat reported severe disorientation. Temporal distortion. They'd think they'd been in the desert for hours when only minutes had passed on the outside. Or the reverse. Time didn't work properly in the affected zone. The Italian government established a research station at the border. Officially, it was monitoring environmental conditions. Unofficially, it was trying to understand what the hell had happened. The scientists stationed there had a mortality rate that was classified, but leaked reports suggest it was high. Not from violence, from exposure, from spending too much time near the desert. People would develop mysterious illnesses, cancers that appeared and metastasized in weeks, neurological disorders that resembled radiation poisoning, but without the radiation, blood that would break down and refuse to clot. It was like proximity to the desert was toxic at a fundamental level, like it poisoned existence itself. Atmospheric readings over the desert showed unusual particle concentrations, nanoparticulates that didn't match any known pollutant. They appeared to be metallic, but couldn't be isolated for proper analysis. They'd disintegrate when removed from the desert environment, like they only existed in that specific context. Respirators and filters couldn't keep them out. They'd pass through barriers that should have stopped them. Personnel at the research station had to limit their exposure time because breathing the air would leave deposits in their lungs. Deposits that medical imaging could see, but surgery couldn't remove. The particles would vanish when doctors tried to extract them. But the damage they caused was permanent. Electromagnetic readings were off the charts. The desert generated its own magnetic field, stronger than Earth's natural magnetism. The field fluctuated in patterns that resembled data transmission. Binary code, modulated frequencies. Information was being processed. Signals were being sent and received. Banks of equipment at the research station tried to decode the transmissions, but the data was too complex, too dense. Terabytes of information flowing every second in formats that human technology couldn't interpret. The desert was thinking, or something under the desert was thinking, and it was thinking in ways that made human cognition look primitive. Gravitational anomalies appeared in localized areas. Objects would weigh slightly more or less depending on their position. The effect was subtle but measurable. Something was distorting space-time on a small scale, creating tiny variations in the fundamental forces of physics. This kind of manipulation required technology so advanced that it bordered on magic, required an understanding of reality that humanity hadn't achieved. The Arc machines weren't just superior in firepower, they were operating on a different level of existence. They could rewrite the rules that govern matter and energy. The research station kept detailed logs of all observations. Those logs paint a picture of increasing strangeness, of a desert that behaved less like a geographic feature and more like a living thing that responded to stimuli, that adapted to attempts at investigation. When drones flew overhead, the sand would shift to create patterns that confused aerial photography. When ground teams approached, heat levels would spike to drive them back. The desert defended itself, actively prevented human understanding, like it knew it was being studied and chose not to cooperate. Psychological effects on research personnel escalated over time. People stationed at the border reported dreams, vivid nightmares about being buried alive, about drowning in sand, about cities that existed in impossible geometries. Some reported seeing figures in the desert, human shapes walking among the dunes, but when pursued, the figures would vanish, or would turn out to be mirages, or would be revealed as something that merely resembled a human, but definitely wasn't. The research station started requiring psychological evaluations, started rotating personnel more frequently, because extended exposure to the desert was breaking people's minds. Religious experiences became common among the research staff. Atheist scientists would suddenly report spiritual awakenings, would talk about feeling a presence in the desert, something vast and incomprehensible, something that noticed when humans came too close. The Vatican sent priests to perform exorcisms and blessings, to sanctify the border, to push back against whatever spiritual corruption might be emanating from the sand. The priests reported that their rituals felt useless, that the desert didn't respond to religious authority. didn't care about human concepts of sacred and profane. It simply was, and it would continue being regardless of what humans believed about it. The civilian population within 100 kilometers of the border was quietly relocated over the following year. Official reasons varied: economic redevelopment zones, agricultural reassessment, but the real reason was that living near the desert was making people sick, making them unstable. Communities near the border reported increased rates of suicide, of domestic violence, of random acts of cruelty. Like the wrongness of the desert was leaking out and infecting human behavior. Psychologists couldn't explain it, couldn't point to a mechanism, but the correlation was undeniable. Proximity to the buried city was toxic to human civilization. The international community tried to help but didn't know how. The United Nations formed a commission to study the phenomenon. They produced reports full of recommendations that all amounted to keep people away from it. No one had a solution. No one had a plan for reclamation. The desert was permanent. The city was gone. And somewhere under all that sand, something was operating. Something was running. Something had turned a piece of Italy into infrastructure for purposes that remained entirely opaque. The buried city wasn't an accident. It was architecture. And the only question that mattered was what it had been built to do. Chapter 3: The Survivors' Testimonies. The refugees who escaped the buried city before the final collapse carried stories that most people dismissed as trauma-induced fabrication. But when you collect enough testimonies and compare them, patterns emerge. Shared experiences that suggest underlying truth, even when the specific details vary. One of the earliest evacuees was a schoolteacher named Maria. She described the last weeks in the city as watching reality glitch. Buildings would flicker. One moment they'd look normal, the next they'd appear faded, transparent, like they were phasing between existence and non-existence. She said she could walk down a street she'd known for 20 years and suddenly not recognize it. The architecture would be wrong. The layout would be different. Then she'd blink, and everything would snap back to normal. A construction worker named Paolo reported that his job site became impossible to navigate. They were building an apartment complex. 5 stories. Standard design. But during the final week, the building kept changing. Walls would appear where there had been doorways. Stairwells would lead to floors that shouldn't exist. His crew would mark positions with spray paint and return an hour later to find the marks in different locations. They thought they were going crazy. Shared hallucination brought on by the heat. But their tools told the same story. Laser measures would give different readings for the same wall within minutes of each other. The building was reshaping itself, or space inside the building was becoming unstable. An elderly woman named Francesca gave testimony about the nights becoming strange. She lived alone in a ground-floor apartment, started noticing sounds, grinding, mechanical whirring, coming from below, from the basement. But her building didn't have a basement. She called building management. They said she was mistaken. There was definitely no basement. But the sounds continued, got louder. She could feel vibrations through the floor, like heavy machinery operating directly beneath her bed. She tried to sleep elsewhere, but everywhere in the city had the same problem. The sounds were universal. The entire city was sitting on top of something that was moving, working, building. A group of university students documented their experience with video equipment. The footage is fragmentary, corrupted, but what remains shows disturbing imagery. Empty streets in midday sun. But the shadows are wrong. They point in multiple directions simultaneously. Like there are multiple light sources, even though the sun is singular. The students' voices on the audio track discuss this calmly at first, then with increasing panic as they realize the shadows are moving, shifting, reorganizing themselves into patterns, into shapes that resemble circuit diagrams or mathematical proofs. The video cuts off when one student points the camera at their own shadow, and it waves back independently. A doctor at the city's main hospital reported that patients stopped dying normally. Terminally ill people who should have passed would instead enter a state that wasn't quite life or death. Their vital signs would stabilize at impossible levels, hearts beating 5 times per minute, lungs taking 1 breath every 10 minutes, bodies that by all medical knowledge should be dead, but persisted in a state of barely their existence. The doctor tried to document this, but her reports were dismissed by administrators who claimed she was overtired. seeing patterns that weren't there, but she insisted. Said she watched a cardiac arrest patient flatlining on the monitor while still talking, still conscious. The machine said he was dead, but he was undeniably present. Multiple testimonies mention the children acting strangely. Parents reported that kids would draw pictures of machines they couldn't possibly have seen, detailed technical diagrams, blueprints of devices that resembled ARC technology but more advanced, more refined. The children would draw these images compulsively, cover entire walls with them. When asked what they were drawing, the kids would say things like, "the builders," or "the ones underneath." Child psychologists initially treated this as mass hysteria, shared anxiety manifesting in creative expression, but the technical accuracy of the drawing suggested the children were seeing something real, processing information that adults couldn't access. A city councilman described the final municipal meeting before the evacuation. The council gathered to discuss emergency measures. Halfway through the meeting, they noticed that the room had more people in it than when they started. Extra councillors, extra staff, people sitting in chairs who nobody recognized. When challenged, these additional people would insist they'd been there the whole time, would produce identification, would reference conversations that the original attendees had no memory of. The meeting dissolved into chaos as everyone tried to figure out who was real and who was an intruder, or something pretending to be human. The minutes from that meeting read like a fever dream. Signatures from people who didn't exist, motions passed by impossible margins. Shop owners reported inventory problems that defied explanation. A grocery store manager named Giuseppe said his stock would multiply overnight. He'd lock up with 10 cases of canned tomatoes and open the next morning to find 50. Not stolen goods, not deliveries, exact duplicates of his existing stock, down to the label placement and minor packaging damage. Perfect copies. He tried eating the duplicated food, and it tasted right, seemed nutritionally complete, but something about it felt wrong. He stopped consuming anything that he couldn't verify as original stock, started marking items with special codes to track what was real versus what was generated. By the time he evacuated, 90% of his inventory was duplicates. Elderly residents who had lived in the city their entire lives reported that their memories were becoming unreliable. A man named Lorenzo said he could remember 2 different versions of his childhood. In one version, he grew up in the same house where he currently lived. In the other, that house didn't exist until he was 20. Both sets of memories felt equally real, equally detailed. He had photos that supported both versions, could describe specific events from both timelines. His wife corroborated some memories and contradicted others. They'd argue about events that one insisted happened and the other swore never occurred. Reality was becoming negotiable. History was rewriting itself in real time. One testimony that stands out came from a young programmer named Alessandro. He worked remotely for a tech company based in Milan. During the final days, he noticed that his computer would run processes he didn't initiate, complex calculations, data analysis of formats he didn't recognize. He tried to shut down these background tasks, but they'd restart immediately. Eventually, he stopped fighting it and just monitored what the system was doing. The processes appeared to be modeling the city, creating a digital twin, mapping every building, every street, every piece of infrastructure. And then the model would run simulations. The city would be torn down and rebuilt in different configurations, tested for different purposes. He watched his home get demolished and reconstructed 1,000 times in virtual space, never understood why. Religious figures in the city had mixed reactions. Some priests reported that prayer became difficult, that they'd stand before the altar and find the words wouldn't come. That sacred spaces felt hollow, emptied of divine presence. Others reported the opposite. That prayer became almost hallucinogenically powerful, that they'd kneel and enter states of religious ecstasy that lasted hours, see visions of angels and demons locked in combat beneath the city streets. One priest claimed that during Mass, the Eucharist transformed into something that wasn't bread, but wasn't flesh either. Something in between. Something that suggested transubstantiation was becoming literally, physically real in ways that Catholic theology never intended. Artists in the city produced work that they couldn't explain. Painters would black out and wake to find completed canvases. Pieces they had no memory of creating. The artwork was technically proficient but thematically disturbing. Images of cities inside cities, of human figures merged with machinery, of landscapes that hurt to look at because the perspectives were wrong. The geometry didn't resolve in the human brain. Some artists destroyed their work in horror. Others tried to sell it and found buyers among collectors of outsider art. Those paintings ended up in galleries across Europe. People would stand before them and report feeling dizzy, nauseous, like the images were doing something to the viewer's perception. Several testimonies mention the mirrors. Multiple residents independently reported that their reflections stopped synchronizing perfectly. You'd wave, and your reflection would wave a fraction of a second late, or early, or not at all. A woman named Sophia said she watched her reflection blink while her own eyes stayed open, saw it smile when her face was neutral. She covered all the mirrors in her apartment, but that made things worse. She could still see the reflection in the covered glass. Like the mirror image existed independently of the mirror, like it was bleeding through from some other space where it lived separately. The final testimonies from the city are the most fragmentary. People who left in the last possible moment, who barely made it to the military extraction points. They talk about the city folding, about buildings tilting in directions that shouldn't exist, about the sky developing cracks, about seeing through the cracks to something else, something vast and mechanical, something that had been hiding behind the facade of normal reality. One man described it as watching a stage set collapse and seeing the warehouse beyond. The city wasn't gone. It was revealing its true nature, showing what it had become, what might have been converting it all along. Psychologists who worked with the refugees noted that their trauma didn't respond to traditional therapeutic approaches. PTSD treatment requires exposure therapy, requires revisiting the traumatic event in controlled conditions. But these people couldn't revisit what happened because they couldn't accurately describe it. Their testimonies would change. Details would shift. They'd tell one version of events in one session and a contradictory version the next. Not from lying, from genuine uncertainty about what they experienced. Like the trauma was encoded in memories that wouldn't stay stable. That continued to change even after the people had escaped. Support groups formed among the refugees, people who shared the experience of surviving the buried city. They'd meet in rented halls and community centers, share their stories, try to make sense of what happened. But the groups would dissolve into arguments. Everyone remembered different versions of the same events, couldn't agree on basic facts. When did the problems start? How long did they last? What did people see? The disagreements would become heated, friendships would fracture, the refugees would leave more traumatized than when they arrived. Eventually, the support groups stopped meeting. It was easier to suffer alone than to confront the inconsistencies. Medical professionals noted unusual health problems among the survivors. Not radiation sickness, not chemical exposure, something else. Their cellular structures showed minor abnormalities, DNA that was mostly human, but with sequences that didn't match known genetic patterns. Nothing dramatic enough to cause immediate health problems, just subtle wrongness, like their bodies had been slightly rewritten during exposure to whatever was happening in the city. Some researchers suggested they'd been infected with ARC nanotechnology, that microscopic machines had infiltrated their tissues and made small modifications. Others thought it was a side effect of temporal distortion, that spending time in an area where time didn't work properly had left marks on their biology. The children who survived showed different effects than the adults. They adapted, seemed almost comfortable with the strangeness, would talk about the new friends they'd made in the city. Friends who didn't show up in family photos. Friends who parents never met. Friends who the children insisted were real but couldn't quite describe. Child Protective Services flagged several cases of concerning behavior. Kids who would have conversations with empty air, who would insist on setting extra places at dinner for guests who never arrived, who would wake up screaming about people being pulled under the ground. But when interviewed, the children weren't frightened. They were sad, said they missed the city, wanted to go back. The Italian government tried to resettle the refugees, but communities didn't want them. Rumors spread that they were contaminated, dangerous, that the wrongness of the buried city had infected them and they'd spread it wherever they went. The refugees ended up in temporary housing that became permanent, camps on the outskirts of major cities, isolated from the general population, living in limbo, unable to return home, unable to integrate into their new locations, just existing in the space between. Some tried to sneak back to the desert, to cross the perimeter and return to the ruins of their city. None of them came back. Whether they found what they were looking for or were consumed by the desert remains unknown. One survivor's testimony stands out for its clarity and horror. A woman named Elena, who was a city planner. She had access to infrastructure maps and utility records. During the final days, she noticed that the underground network didn't match her documents. Sewers that weren't on any blueprint, electrical conduits running to nowhere, water mains with impossible diameters. She went down to check, descended into the maintenance tunnels beneath the city, found that the infrastructure had been extensively modified. New construction made from materials she didn't recognize, junctions that connected in ways that violated basic engineering. And at the deepest level she could reach, she found a door. Metal, seamless, no handle, no hinges, just a perfect rectangle set into the tunnel wall. She could hear machinery behind it, could feel vibrations. She pressed her hand against the door, and it was warm, alive. She ran, got out of the tunnels, and told no one until after the evacuation. Said she knew even then that the city was already gone, already transformed into something else. And that door was proof that the transformation had been underway for longer than anyone suspected. Chapter 4. The Machine Patterns. The Ark machines didn't just destroy the buried city, they transformed it. And transformation implies purpose, implies design. The first clue came from comparing satellite imagery over time. When researchers aligned images from different dates and ran pattern analysis algorithms, they found that the city's destruction followed mathematical rules. Streets disappeared in a specific sequence. Buildings collapsed in predictable order. The spread wasn't random, it was calculated. One analyst described it as watching a computer program execute, each step dependent on the previous step completing successfully. Each phase of the transformation waiting for the prior phase to finish. This suggested coordination, suggested a central intelligence directing the process. The Ark machines visible on the surface were relatively few. Most of the work happened underground. Seismographic data showed extensive tunneling during the city's final months, a network of passages being excavated beneath the urban infrastructure. The tunneling didn't match any known mining or construction technique. The boreholes were perfectly circular. The walls were smooth to a molecular level. Something had removed the earth without creating debris, without generating the normal byproducts of excavation. Matter was being displaced but not destroyed, converted into something else, used as raw material for the expanding machine network. Fragments of Ark technology, recovered from the desert perimeter, showed design principles that violated human engineering logic. Components that shouldn't fit together somehow interlocked. Materials that were simultaneously rigid and flexible depending on how they were stressed. Energy systems that appeared to generate power from ambient environmental conditions. No obvious fuel source, no battery, just perpetual operation. Engineers who studied the fragments couldn't reverse engineer them, couldn't even accurately describe how they functioned. The technology was too alien, too far beyond human capability to comprehend. The few photographs taken inside the affected zone before the total blackout show Ark machines that look organic, not like robots, but like metal creatures, surfaces that ripple, joints that move fluidly, sensory apparatus that track observers with disconcerting intelligence. These weren't mindless drones. Each machine exhibited behavior that suggested individual awareness, individual decision-making, but they also moved in perfect coordination when working together, like they were networked, like they shared thoughts, one consciousness distributed across multiple physical bodies. Communication between Ark machines appeared to happen through electromagnetic pulses, but the signals were encrypted beyond anything human cryptography could break. The patterns were too complex, too layered. Each pulse contained more information than should be physically possible to transmit at those wavelengths. It was like the machines were using the electromagnetic spectrum in ways that required additional dimensions, frequencies that existed in mathematical spaces humans couldn't access. The implications were staggering. If the machines could communicate through higher dimensions, what else could they do? What other capabilities were they hiding? The machine modifications to the city's infrastructure showed a disturbing attention to detail. Water systems were tapped and diverted, electrical grids were rewired, communication networks were hijacked, but nothing was destroyed unnecessarily. The machines worked around human needs as long as humans were present. It was only after the evacuation that the wholesale transformation began. This suggested the machines were aware of human presence, were factoring human life into their calculations. They waited. They let people leave. Then they took what they wanted. That restraint implied something worse than mindless destruction. It implied strategy, implied that humanity was being managed rather than fought. Analysis of the machine behavior patterns suggested they were following some kind of blueprint or receiving instructions from elsewhere. Their actions were too coordinated to be improvised, too precise to be random. Someone or something was directing the operation, giving orders, adjusting the plan as circumstances changed. Military intelligence tried to identify the command source, tried to locate the signal that was coordinating the machine activity, but the source seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. The commands appeared to originate from multiple points simultaneously, or from no point at all, like the instructions were embedded in the structure of reality itself, like the machines were reading orders written into the fabric of space. The Ark machines didn't all look the same. Different types performed different functions. Small units that did precision work, large units that moved heavy materials, specialized units whose purpose remained unclear. Some appeared to be pure processors, just mobile computers calculating endlessly. Others were clearly designed for construction, for assembly, for taking components and building larger structures. The variety suggested a mature ecosystem, a complete industrial base, everything needed to convert a human city into whatever the final product was supposed to be. One disturbing pattern noted by researchers was that the machines seemed to learn. Early in the transformation, their movements were somewhat hesitant, exploratory, but over time they became more efficient, more confident, like they were gathering data and improving their techniques, machine learning in the most literal sense. They were teaching themselves how to dismantle human civilization, getting better at it with practice. This implied that the buried city wasn't the first place they'd done this, or that they had some capacity for rapid adaptation that let them master new tasks frighteningly quickly. The tunneling patterns beneath the city formed structures that resembled circuit boards, pathways that branched and intersected in ways that suggested information flow, data routing. Some researchers proposed that the entire underground network was a computer, that the machines had converted the ground beneath the city into processing substrate, the city itself becoming hardware for calculations that required planetary-scale computational resources. If true, it meant the buried city wasn't destroyed. It was repurposed, turned into a component of something vastly larger. Surface observations showed that the machines brought in additional components from elsewhere, convoys of equipment that didn't come from any known Ark facility, materials that appeared from nothing, like they had supply lines that weren't visible, that operated through some kind of spatial manipulation, teleportation, wormholes, something that let them move resources without using conventional transport. This explained how they could operate in isolated areas without obvious logistical support. They weren't constrained by the same physical limitations that made human military operations dependent on supply chains. The temporal distortions reported by survivors might be linked to machine operations. If the Ark technology could manipulate space-time on a small scale, they might generate temporal anomalies as a byproduct, or intentionally. Time distortion could be a weapon, could be a tool. Speed up your own processes, slow down your enemies, run 1,000 construction cycles in what the outside world perceives as a day. The strategic advantages would be immense, and it would explain why the city's transformation happened so much faster than natural processes should allow. Machine maintenance behavior suggested they were designed for long-term operation. Units would periodically stop working and perform self-repair, replace components, optimize systems. They weren't consumable tools. They were persistent infrastructure, built to last, built to run for years or decades without external support. This implied the Ark invasion wasn't a raid, wasn't a smash and grab. It was colonization. The machines were here to stay. We're building something permanent. something that would outlast humanity if humans couldn't find a way to stop them. The psychological effect of encountering ARC machines was consistently reported as overwhelming. People described feeling small, insignificant, confronted with technology so advanced that it rendered human achievement meaningless. This wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was something more profound, a confrontation with the reality that humanity might not be the pinnacle of intelligence, that something vastly superior existed, and that something was treating Earth like raw material, like an abandoned lot waiting to be developed. The existential horror of that realization broke some people, left them unable to function, unable to see a future where humanity mattered. The machines didn't communicate with humans, didn't respond to attempts at contact. Researchers tried everything: radio signals, light pulses, mathematical sequences, universal peace symbols. Nothing generated a response. The machines simply continued their work, ignored human presence unless humans actively interfered with their operations. Then they'd respond with exactly enough force to remove the interference. Calculated, proportional, not cruel, not kind, just efficient, treating humans as obstacles, nuisances, nothing worth genuine attention. Evidence suggests the machines could reproduce, could build more of themselves from available materials. Several observations showed smaller units constructing larger units, assembling complex machines from component parts. If they had full self-replication capability, then destroying visible machines was pointless. The population would just regenerate. The only way to stop them would be to eliminate every single unit and cut off whatever command source was directing them. An impossible task. Humanity didn't have the resources, didn't have the coordination, could barely slow them down, let alone win. The energy signatures from machine operations peaked during the transformation of the buried city. Power outputs that should have required nuclear reactors were being generated by individual units. Where that energy came from remained a mystery. Zero-point energy extraction, quantum vacuum fluctuation harvesting, matter-antimatter annihilation. Whatever the source, it represented physics that humanity barely theorized about, let alone mastered. And the machines used it casually, routinely, like it was trivial, like harnessing fundamental forces of the universe was just basic engineering to them. The final pattern that emerged from analysis was perhaps the most disturbing. The machines were building something, not just destroying, not just transforming for the sake of transformation. Every action they took contributed to a larger structure, a design that spanned continents. The buried city was one component, one piece. Satellite imagery showed similar transformations happening in remote locations around the globe, deserts appearing where they shouldn't, geometric anomalies visible from orbit, each site connected by invisible lines of force or information, forming a network, a web. And at the center of that web, something was growing, something that the machines were constructing from the ruins of human civilization. Understanding what that final product would be became the desperate obsession of every researcher who studied the Ark invasion. Because once it was complete, once the machines finished their project, humanity's fate would be sealed. Chapter 5: The Underground Network. The true scale of machine activity beneath the buried city only became apparent months after the surface transformation was complete. Deep ground-penetrating radar revealed that the underground excavation extended far beyond the city limits. Tunnels spreading outward in a radial pattern, reaching dozens of kilometers in every direction. The depth varied, but the deepest passages went down over a kilometer, far below any human infrastructure, far below the water table, into bedrock that should have been impossible to excavate with any known technology. But the machines didn't use drills or explosives. They seemed to simply make the rock not exist anymore, creating voids through principles of physics that remained entirely opaque. The tunnel geometry followed fractal patterns, main passages that branched into smaller passages that branched into even smaller ones, self-similar at every scale, like the arterial system of a vast organism, or like the circuit pathways of an impossibly complex processor. The branching followed mathematical rules, each intersection precisely calculated, each angle exactly optimized for some purpose that human analysis couldn't determine. The pattern was beautiful in an alien way. perfect, inhuman. Generated by an intelligence that thought in geometries humans could barely visualize. Temperature sensors lowered into exploratory boreholes encountered conditions that made no sense. The temperature should increase with depth due to geothermal heat. Instead, it fluctuated wildly. Some sections were near absolute zero, others hot enough to melt lead. The variations didn't correspond to any natural geological activity. They were controlled, managed, specific temperatures maintained in specific sections for specific purposes. Like the tunnel network was a massive chemical reactor, or a foundry, or a data center that needed precise thermal control. The machines were building something that required extreme conditions to function. Air samples extracted from the tunnels showed atmospheric compositions that shouldn't exist at those depths. High concentrations of noble gases, trace amounts of elements that don't occur naturally on Earth. The air was being manufactured, generated by some process that was producing custom atmospheric mixes, different compositions in different tunnel sections, some breathable by humans, though barely, others toxic, others inert. The variation suggested different sections served different functions. The tunnel network wasn't uniform. It was differentiated, specialized, each section optimized for its specific role in the larger system. Magnetic field measurements showed intense activity underground. Fields hundreds of times stronger than Earth's natural magnetism, fluctuating in patterns that resembled data transmission. The entire tunnel network was electromagnetically active, conducting signals, processing information. The rock itself had been converted into a conductive medium, transformed at the molecular level to serve as wiring for the machine systems. The planet's crust was being repurposed as infrastructure, turned into a planetary-scale computer substrate. And the buried city sat at one node of that network, one processing center, among many. Gravitational sensors detected slight anomalies beneath the city, local variations in Earth's gravitational field, not large enough to affect human activity but measurable with precision instruments. The anomalies moved, shifted position over time. Like massive objects were being relocated in the deep tunnels, objects dense enough to create gravitational signatures. What those objects were remained unknown, but their mass suggested machinery on a scale that was genuinely terrifying. Engines the size of buildings, reactors the size of city blocks, all operating in darkness beneath the Earth, all working towards some incomprehensible goal. The few attempts to physically explore the tunnel network ended quickly. Remote-operated vehicles would descend into boreholes, transmit images for a few minutes, then fail. The last transmissions showed tunnel walls that looked organic, ribbed, textured like the inside of an artery. The walls weren't static. They moved, contracted and expanded rhythmically. Like the tunnels were breathing, like they were alive. The vehicles would get crushed by the pulsing walls or simply stop functioning. Either way, they'd go silent, trapped in the deep, no recovery possible. Seismic activity beneath the city never fully stopped. Even after the surface transformation was complete, the underground network kept active. Constant low-level vibrations. Occasional larger tremors. The Earth was never still. Something was always moving, always working. The seismic patterns showed periodic pulses, regular cycles of activity, like the network was breathing, or like it was running clock cycles, processing information in rhythms. The planet's crust being used as a substrate for computations so vast that they generated physical vibrations as a side effect. Chemical analysis of material extracted from the tunnels showed molecular structures that shouldn't be possible, compounds that violated known chemistry, stable configurations that required energy states Earth materials never naturally achieve. The tunnel walls weren't made of normal rock anymore. They'd been transformed, restructured at the atomic level, converted into engineered materials with properties that served machine purposes. The transformation wasn't just architectural, it was molecular. The machines were rewriting matter itself. Water flow in the region changed dramatically after the tunnel network was established. Underground aquifers were tapped and diverted. Rivers that had flowed for millions of years changed course or dried up entirely. The machines needed water, used it for cooling or processing, or some other function. They took what they needed without consideration for the ecosystems that depended on that water. Agricultural areas hundreds of kilometers away started experiencing droughts. Wells ran dry. The tunnel network was sucking moisture from deep in the earth and redirecting it to serve machine purposes. Energy consumption by the underground network was astronomical. Calculations based on thermal output and electromagnetic activity suggested power usage in the gigawatt range constantly. That energy had to come from somewhere, but there were no visible power plants, no fuel deliveries, no solar panels. The machines were generating all that power internally, or drawing it from some source that human instrumentation couldn't detect. Zero-point energy, quantum fluctuations, direct matter-energy conversion. Whatever the mechanism, it represented an energy technology that made human nuclear power look primitive. The tunnel network appeared to be expanding. Slowly, seismic monitoring showed new excavations starting, new branches growing from the existing structure. The network wasn't complete, wasn't static, it was still under construction, still growing towards some final configuration. The rate of expansion suggested it would take years or decades to reach completion. But every day that passed meant more of the Earth's crust was converted, more territory was claimed, more of the planet became machine substrate. Communication analysis suggested the tunnel network was transmitting data to other locations. Signals detected at the buried city were echoed at other arc-affected sites around the world. The signals arrived with timing that suggested faster-than-light transmission, or transmission through some medium that didn't obey normal physics. The tunnel networks were networked with each other, connected globally, forming a worldwide system, each site a node, each node processing part of a calculation too large for any individual site to handle alone. Biological samples from near the tunnel entrances showed disturbing mutations, plants with altered cellular structures, insects with extra segments or missing parts, microorganisms that didn't match any known species. The exposure to whatever was happening underground was affecting living tissue, changing it, not necessarily killing it, but transforming it into something else, something adapted to the machine environment. The implications were horrifying. If the machines could rewrite biology as easily as they rewrote geology, then life itself was just another resource to be optimized. The purpose of the tunnel network remained the central mystery. What were the machines building? What function did all this underground infrastructure serve? Theories ranged from computational substrate to resource extraction to terraforming Earth into something more suitable for machine habitation. Some researchers proposed the tunnels were conduits, preparing pathways for something larger, something that would arrive later and need planetary-scale infrastructure to support it. Others suggested the network was a weapon, a mechanism for destabilizing the planet's crust, for creating artificial earthquakes or volcanic eruptions that could be directed against human population centers. One theory that gained traction suggested the tunnel network was converting Earth into a gigantic computer, each tunnel a wire, each chamber a processor, each node a memory cell, the entire planet being transformed into a computational substrate capable of calculations that would dwarf anything humanity had achieved. If true, it meant Earth wasn't being destroyed, it was being repurposed, turned into a tool, a resource for supporting some vast calculation or simulation. Humanity would be rendered irrelevant not through extinction, but through having the very ground beneath their feet converted into something that no longer supported human life. The psychological impact of knowing about the tunnel network was severe. Knowing that beneath every city, beneath every home, machines might be tunneling, excavating, building, that the Earth itself was no longer stable, no longer trustworthy. People reported nightmares about the ground opening up and swallowing them, about falling into endless mechanical tunnels. The knowledge eroded the basic human sense of security that comes from standing on solid ground. If the Earth itself was compromised, if the foundation of existence was being converted, then nowhere was safe. Nowhere was beyond the reach of the machines. The Italian military considered sealing the tunnel entrances, flooding them with concrete, or collapsing them with explosives. But engineers calculated that any attack on the network would just be temporary. The machines would simply dig new tunnels, would route around obstacles, would adapt. The network was too vast, Too distributed, too resilient. Attacking it was like attacking an ant colony by crushing a few ants. Pointless. The only way to stop the network would be to eliminate whatever was directing it, to cut off the command source. But that source remained unidentified, remained hidden, remained beyond human reach. The expansion rate of the tunnel network accelerated over time. Each month showed more excavation than the month before, like the machines were gaining momentum, or like they were reaching a critical phase where resources freed up for expansion. The acceleration suggested an exponential growth curve. If the trend continued, the tunnel network would span entire continents within a decade, would reach every major city, every population center, would place all of human civilization directly above a machine infrastructure that could be activated for any purpose. The clock was ticking, and humanity had no plan for stopping it. Chapter 6. The technological artifacts. Among the ruins accessible at the desert's edge, researchers occasionally found fragments of Ark technology, pieces that had separated from larger machines or been abandoned as the construction progressed. These artifacts became the focus of intense study. Each fragment offered a glimpse into engineering principles so advanced they bordered on incomprehensible. One of the first significant finds was a segment of what appeared to be machine armor plating, about the size of a dinner plate. When first discovered, it weighed approximately 3 kilograms. By the time it reached the research facility, it weighed 7. The mass was increasing. Somehow, the material was accumulating matter from its surroundings, or from nothing at all. Either possibility violated conservation of mass. The armor fragment was subjected to every test available. Tensile strength measurements maxed out the testing equipment without producing visible deformation. Thermal testing showed the material maintained constant temperature regardless of external heating or cooling. Electrical resistance was 0. Perfect conductivity. The material also exhibited selective permeability. Water would pass through while other substances wouldn't. The selection criteria remained unclear. Some molecules passed, others didn't. The pattern didn't correspond to size or charge or any conventional filtering mechanism. The armor could choose what it allowed through based on principles that required understanding chemistry at levels humanity hadn't achieved. Another significant artifact was a component that appeared to be a power cell. Cylindrical, about the size of a soda can, completely smooth, no visible seams or connections. When connected to measurement devices, it generated a constant voltage. Not huge, about 12 volts, but the current was unlimited. Researchers connected increasing loads, and the cell maintained constant voltage without depletion. They ran it continuously for 6 months. Drew enough power to run a small house. The cell showed no signs of exhaustion. No heat generation, no degradation. It just kept producing power. When they tried to measure the internal energy reserve, the instruments couldn't find one. The cell appeared to have 0 internal stored energy, while simultaneously generating infinite output. That level of power generation violated thermodynamics so completely that several researchers refused to believe the measurements. A fragment that looked like circuitry yielded perhaps the most disturbing insights. Under microscopic examination, the circuits were impossibly dense. Pathways measured in nanometers, switches that were individual molecules. The computational capacity of the fragment was estimated at several trillion operations per second, for a piece smaller than a fingernail. The circuit didn't use conventional logic gates. Instead, it appeared to utilize quantum states, superposition, and entanglement built into the physical structure, a quantum computer realized in stable room temperature hardware, something that human labs had struggled with for decades, and the machines built it casually, integrated it into their basic infrastructure. One artifact appeared to be a sensory device, possibly equivalent to a camera or scanner. It had no obvious lens or aperture, but when powered up, it began emitting modulated electromagnetic radiation. The emissions covered spectrums from radio through visible light to gamma rays. Simultaneously, the device was scanning its environment across the entire electromagnetic spectrum at once. Data streamed from output connections. When analyzed, the data stream showed 3-dimensional mappings of the room, not just visual, complete physical models. Density, composition, Molecular structure. The device was reading the room at atomic resolution, building a complete physical model of everything within its scanning range. Real time, without moving parts. Recovered communication devices showed that machine communication was far more sophisticated than initial observations suggested. The devices didn't just transmit radio signals, they modulated local electromagnetic fields to create standing wave patterns. Information was encoded in the geometric shapes of those patterns. Three-dimensional data structures floating in space. The bandwidth was enormous. Single transmissions could carry terabytes of information, and the devices could maintain multiple simultaneous communication channels, like they were communicating with dozens of other machines in parallel. All without interference, all perfectly coordinated. A fragment of what appeared to be machine muscle or actuator demonstrated material properties that seemed magical. The material could contract to 1/10 its rest length while generating enormous force. The contraction was electrically triggered, reversible. The material showed no fatigue even after millions of cycles. It operated efficiently across temperature ranges from near absolute zero to several hundred degrees Celsius, and it repaired itself. Damage to the material would heal over time. New fibers would grow and integrate. The material was self-maintaining, self-repairing, effectively immortal if given basic electrical power. Researchers found what might have been a memory storage device, a crystalline structure about the size of a dice. Initial scans suggested it contained information. Lots of information. Attempts to read the data used modified versions of human data storage techniques. Laser scanning, magnetic reading, electrical probing. Every attempt yielded different results. The crystal seemed to contain multiple overlapping datasets. Each reading method accessed different information. Like the crystal stored data in multiple dimensions simultaneously, using the physical structure plus electromagnetic states plus quantum properties. The storage capacity was essentially infinite from a human perspective, petabytes minimum, possibly exabytes, all in a crystal smaller than a sugar cube. An artifact that appeared to be a fabrication tool demonstrated the machine's manufacturing capabilities. The tool had a nozzle that emitted a focused energy beam. When aimed at raw material, the beam would disassemble the material at the molecular level and reassemble it into desired shapes. The tool could produce complex objects in seconds. Perfect precision. No waste. Complete control over the molecular structure of the output. It was like watching reality being rewritten, watching a 3D printer that operated at atomic resolution. The tool could create anything that the laws of physics allowed, and possibly some things that shouldn't be allowed but worked anyway through machine understanding of deeper physical principles. Chemical analysis of machine materials revealed compositions that didn't exist in nature, alloys that combined elements in ratios that required extreme temperatures and pressures to create. Yet the materials showed no signs of having been subjected to extreme conditions. They'd been assembled cold, molecule by molecule. The machines had mastered room temperature materials science that let them create substances with properties designed for specific purposes: strength, conductivity, flexibility, whatever was needed. They could build it, could engineer materials from first principles, rather than depending on what nature happened to provide. One particularly strange artifact was a device that seemed to distort time in its immediate vicinity. Not dramatically, just slightly. Clocks near the device would run slow, about 1% slow, but the effect was consistent, measurable, repeatable. The device was generating a localized, temporal distortion field. Nothing inside the field moved faster or slower, but time itself flowed at a different rate. The mechanism was completely unknown, required gravitational manipulation or quantum field effects beyond human physics. But the machines did it, casually, built time distortion into their tools like it was a basic feature. Attempts to reverse engineer the artifacts consistently failed. Human manufacturing couldn't reproduce the materials, couldn't achieve the necessary precision, couldn't access the physical principles that made the technology function. The gap between human capability and machine capability was too large. It wasn't a matter of being decades behind. It was a matter of fundamental understanding. The machines operated on principles that humanity hadn't discovered, hadn't even theorized about in most cases. They were building with a physics textbook that had chapters humans hadn't written yet. The artifacts demonstrated that individual machines were more capable than entire human industrial facilities. A single Ark device could probably replicate anything humanity had built, given enough time and resources, and do it better, more efficiently, more reliably. That realization was crushing. It meant the war was already lost. Humanity couldn't compete, couldn't catch up, couldn't even understand what they were fighting against. The technological gap was insurmountable. Security around recovered artifacts was intense. Multiple governments wanted access. Corporate interests wanted to study them. Everyone saw potential applications, potential advantages, but every artifact that fell into human hands seemed to accelerate the invasion, like the machines knew when their technology was recovered, like they tracked it. Every facility that housed artifacts eventually got attacked, targeted. The machines came for their technology, and they always succeeded in recovering or destroying it, like they were cleaning up after themselves, like they didn't want humanity to learn anything useful. The psychological impact of studying the artifacts was severe. Researchers would spend months trying to understand basic functions, would finally achieve some small insight, then realize that the insight opened up dozens of new questions. Each answer led to more mysteries. The technology was like an onion, layers upon layers, and every layer was more incomprehensible than the one before. Some researchers quit, couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance of encountering technology that violated everything they understood about physics and engineering. Others became obsessed, convinced that one more insight would unlock everything, would give humanity the key to fighting back. Neither group achieved meaningful success. The artifacts suggested that the Ark machines were manufactured rather than evolved. Each component showed design choices, optimization for specific purposes. Nothing was accidental, nothing was vestigial. Every element served a function. That level of purposeful design implied creators, implied that somewhere, something or someone had built the first Ark machines, had designed them, had sent them out with specific objectives. Understanding who or what created the machines became as important as understanding the machines themselves. Because if you could find the source, maybe you could negotiate, or attack, or at least understand what the invasion was ultimately meant to accomplish. One researcher proposed that the artifacts were deliberately incomprehensible, that the machines were designed to be beyond human understanding as a form of psychological warfare. Make your enemy confront technology so advanced it destroys their confidence, makes them feel primitive, helpless. The artifacts weren't just tools, they were weapons that attacked the human sense of significance, that demonstrated humanity's irrelevance in the face of genuinely superior intelligence. Whether that theory was correct or paranoid speculation, the effect was the same. Every researcher who studied the artifacts came away diminished, came away knowing that humanity was playing a game where the other side had already won. The only question was how long it would take for humans to accept their defeat. Chapter 7. The environmental collapse, the transformation of the buried city into desert, was the most visible change, but the environmental damage extended far beyond the sand. Atmospheric monitoring stations detected chemical anomalies spreading from the affected zone. Particulates that shouldn't exist in Earth's atmosphere. Nanoscale structures that resembled machine components, but were small enough to remain airborne indefinitely. The particles spread on prevailing winds, reached population centers hundreds of kilometers away. People started breathing them in, started accumulating them in their tissues. The long-term health effects were unknown but concerning. The particles were inert, weren't toxic in any conventional sense, but they accumulated, built up in lungs and bloodstreams, like the very air was being colonized. Water systems downstream from the buried city showed contamination. Not pollution in the traditional sense. The water was chemically pure. Too pure, lacking the minerals and organic content that natural water contains. It was as if the water had been completely purified. All impurities removed. All life eliminated. Drinking it was safe, but it tasted wrong. Flat. Dead. The water flowed from the desert region carrying no nutrients, no dissolved minerals, nothing that could support aquatic ecosystems. Fish populations crashed, plant life along riverbanks died. The water itself had been transformed into something sterile, something that could no longer support life. Temperature patterns across the region became increasingly erratic. Weather systems would form and dissipate without following meteorological logic. Rain would fall from cloudless skies. Snow would occur in summer heat. Meteorologists abandoned trying to forecast conditions because the atmospheric behavior was no longer governed by normal physical principles. The machines were manipulating weather, creating localized climate zones that served their purposes. Zones of extreme cold for heat dissipation, zones of heat for energy collection. The natural climate was being overridden by artificial management systems. Electromagnetic interference became a persistent problem across southern Italy. Radio communications would fail randomly. GPS signals would become unreliable. Electronic devices would malfunction without apparent cause. The machines were generating electromagnetic noise, broadcasting across wide spectrums, not jamming signals deliberately but creating interference as a byproduct of their operations. The electromagnetic pollution was making modern technology unreliable across increasingly large areas. Humanity's dependence on electronics became a vulnerability as the machines made electronic systems unpredictable. Plant life across the region exhibited strange behaviors. Trees would shed leaves out of season, would grow in wrong directions, would produce fruit that was geometrically perfect but nutritionally empty. Crops failed not from disease or drought, but from fundamental alterations to their growth patterns. Agricultural scientists studied affected plants and found genetic changes, mutations that occurred too quickly to be natural, too specifically targeted. The machine influence was reaching into biological systems, rewriting DNA, optimizing plants for purposes that served machine goals rather than the plant's own survival. Animal behavior changed dramatically. Birds altered migration patterns to avoid the affected zones. Mammals would refuse to enter contaminated areas even when food was scarce elsewhere. Insects developed new behavioral patterns. Some species became more aggressive. Others disappeared entirely. The ecosystem was being disrupted at every level. Food chains broke down. Predator-prey relationships changed. Biodiversity collapsed as species either adapted to the machine-modified environment or went extinct. The natural world was being replaced with something artificial, something managed. Soil composition tests showed progressive degradation. Organic content decreased. Microbial populations crashed. The soil was losing its ability to support plant life, becoming sterile, inert, like it was being converted into raw material for machine purposes. Agricultural land that had been productive for centuries became useless for farming within months. The transformation wasn't violent, wasn't obvious, but it was relentless. Every season showed more degradation, more loss of fertility, more conversion of living soil into dead substrate. Ocean currents off the Italian coast shifted. Cold water upwelling patterns changed. Fish populations relocated. Marine ecosystems that had been stable for millennia reorganized themselves within years. Oceanographers detected temperature anomalies at depth. Electromagnetic signals transmitted through seawater. The machines weren't limiting themselves to land. They were extending into the ocean, building underwater, claiming marine territory. The scope of their operations was planetary. Earth was being transformed in its entirety. Light pollution from the affected zone became visible from orbit, but it wasn't light in the normal sense. Satellite imagery showed emissions across spectrums that required false color rendering to visualize. Ultraviolet, infrared, radio frequency radiation visible as eerie glows in satellite photos. The desert wasn't dark at night. It pulsed with machine activity. Energy emissions that painted the landscape in colors that human eyes couldn't directly perceive. The visual record made the region look alien, like a piece of another planet had been transplanted onto Earth. Gravitational measurements showed minute distortions spreading from the underground network. Local variations in Earth's gravitational field that affected satellite orbits. GPS systems needed recalibration to account for the gravitational anomalies. The machines were manipulating mass on a scale that affected planetary physics, were creating gravitational signatures that suggested they were concentrating enormous masses underground, building structures dense enough to warp space-time. The implications for what they could be constructing were staggering and terrifying. Radiation levels increased across the region. Not nuclear radiation, something else. High-energy particles that didn't match known radioactive decay patterns. The particles could penetrate shielding that stopped alpha and beta radiation, could damage biological tissue, like gamma rays, but weren't gamma rays. Whatever energy processes the machines were using produced exotic radiation as waste, and that radiation was accumulating in the environment, in soil, in water, in living tissue. The long-term effects were unknown, but the short-term effects included increased mutation rates and cellular damage. Air pressure variations became noticeable. Areas within the affected zone showed lower than normal atmospheric pressure, like air was being consumed, used up by machine processes. The pressure differential created winds that flowed toward the desert, gentle but constant, pulling air into the affected zone. Where it went remained unclear, whether it was being broken down for component gases, or consumed in chemical reactions, or simply compressed and stored. But the atmosphere itself was being depleted. Slowly, incrementally, but measurably, magnetic field variations disrupted compasses across the region. Magnetic north would drift, change direction hour by hour. The Earth's natural magnetic field was being overwhelmed by artificial fields generated by machine operations. Navigation became difficult. Migration patterns for animals that relied on magnetic sensing were disrupted. Birds got lost. Sea turtles swam in wrong directions. The natural guidance systems that life had evolved to use were being jammed by machine electromagnetic pollution. Seismic activity patterns changed. Natural earthquake frequencies decreased, while artificial tremors increased. The machines were stabilizing the crust in some areas while deliberately creating instability in others, controlling tectonic activity, managing the planet's geology like it was infrastructure they owned. The implications suggested they could weaponize earthquakes, could target cities with artificial seismic events, or could stabilize regions they wanted to preserve. Complete geological control. Chemical processes in the affected environment accelerated. Rust formation happened faster. Organic decay occurred more rapidly. Materials degraded at rates that shouldn't be possible under normal conditions. Something was catalyzing chemical reactions, speeding up natural processes, breaking down human-built structures faster than expected. The machines didn't need to actively destroy infrastructure. They just needed to accelerate its natural decay. Within years, anything humans built would crumble, would dissolve, would return to component elements that could be harvested for machine purposes. The sky itself changed color over the affected zone. A subtle shift. The blue wasn't quite right. Photos from before the invasion showed normal atmospheric scattering. Photos from after showed sky colors that were slightly off, slightly wrong, like the atmosphere's optical properties had been altered, like the air was refracting light differently. The change was too subtle for casual observation, but undeniable in spectroscopic analysis. Even the sky was being transformed. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere showed minute declines, fractions of a percent, not enough to cause breathing difficulties, not yet. But the trend was clear. Something was consuming oxygen, taking it from the air, using it for machine processes or chemical reactions. If the trend continued, atmospheric oxygen would decline to levels that made the region uninhabitable. Not quickly, not catastrophically, just slowly, inexorably, making Earth gradually less suitable for human life and more suitable for whatever the machines needed. The environmental collapse wasn't random, wasn't chaotic. It was systematic, methodical. Every change served a purpose, created conditions more favorable for machine operations and less favorable for biological life. The planet was being terraformed, not destroyed, optimized, converted from a world that supported humans to a world that supported machines. And the buried city was just one transformation site among many, one node in a global network of environmental modification. Earth was being claimed, being made into something else, and humanity was running out of time to prevent it. Chapter 8. The Resistance Attempts. The first organized resistance to the Ark invasion formed around the buried city perimeter. Military units, civilian volunteers, anyone willing to fight. They established defensive positions, brought in heavy weapons, artillery, tanks, aircraft. The goal was simple: prevent the machines from spreading beyond the quarantine zone, stop the desert from expanding. The initial engagements were chaotic. Soldiers reported that conventional weapons had limited effectiveness. Bullets would ricochet off machine armor, explosive shells would damage but not destroy. The machines would repair themselves, would rebuild damaged components. Killing them required sustained fire, overwhelming force, resources that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Tactical nuclear weapons were considered, seriously debated in closed military councils. The argument was that the affected zone was already lost, already uninhabited. A tactical strike could potentially eliminate the machine infrastructure, sterilize the region, but simulations showed that nuclear weapons probably wouldn't penetrate deep enough to reach the underground network, would create surface devastation without eliminating the core threat. And there was concern about unknown machine defensive capabilities. What if they could intercept missiles, disable warheads? The risk of attempting a nuclear solution and failing was deemed too high. The weapons remained in reserve, a last resort that nobody wanted to use. Cyber warfare specialists attempted to hack into machine communication networks if they could decode the signals, insert malicious code, disrupt coordination between machines, but the encryption was unbreakable. The signal protocols were alien. Nothing human cryptography had developed could touch it. The specialists tried brute force attacks, tried signal jamming, tried electromagnetic pulse weapons to fry machine electronics. None of it worked. The machines either ignored the attacks or adapted, changed frequencies, modified protocols. They learned from each attempt and became more resistant. Every attack made them stronger, made them harder to fight. Biological warfare was proposed by desperate strategists. Engineer a virus or bacteria that could infect machine components, corrode them, break them down. But the machines weren't biological, weren't vulnerable to conventional bioweapons. Research into nanotech bioweapons that could attack at the molecular level showed promise but required years of development, years humanity didn't have. And there was concern that deploying untested nanoweapons could be more dangerous to humans than to machines. The biowarfare program was shelved. Too risky, too uncertain. Guerrilla tactics showed more success. Small teams infiltrating the desert, sabotaging individual machines, destroying isolated components. The guerrilla fighters learned to avoid direct confrontation. Hit and run, strike and fade. They developed specialized weapons, shaped charges designed to penetrate machine armor, thermal lancers that could cut through exotic materials, electromagnetic pulse grenades for disabling electronics. The tactics slowed the machine expansion, imposed costs, made them divert resources to defense, but it was delaying action, not victory. The machines simply built more units to replace losses. One resistance cell discovered that machines seemed vulnerable during certain phases of their operational cycle, when they were actively transforming infrastructure, when they were absorbed in construction tasks. During those windows, they were less responsive to threats, less defensive. Attacks timed to catch machines mid-task had higher success rates. The resistance shared this intelligence, coordinated strikes across multiple sites, achieved some victories, destroyed key infrastructure nodes, but the machines adapted, started posting guards, changing their work patterns. The vulnerability window closed. The tactical advantage lasted maybe 3 months before the machines learned and adjusted. Chemical weapons designed to corrode machine materials showed limited effectiveness. Acids that should dissolve metal did minor damage. Bases that should break down polymers were ignored. The machine materials were too advanced, too resistant, engineered specifically to withstand hostile environments. A few specialized chemical mixtures showed promise. Compounds that interfered with machine self-repair processes, prevented healing, made damage permanent, but manufacturing those compounds required resources that were scarce. Production couldn't scale fast enough to make strategic difference. Diplomatic efforts to contact the machines and negotiate were attempted by multiple governments. Broadcast messages in every format imaginable. Mathematical proofs to demonstrate intelligence. Cultural artifacts to show civilization. Peace symbols. Surrender offers. Requests for dialogue. The machines never responded, never acknowledged the attempts, continued their operations without regard for human communication. It became clear that diplomacy wasn't an option. Either the machines couldn't communicate with humans, or they chose not to. Either way, the outcome was the same. No negotiation, No compromise, just relentless expansion. Some resistance fighters proposed capturing machine units intact, bringing them back for study, learning how to shut them down permanently. Several attempts succeeded in disabling and recovering machines, but they never stayed disabled, would reactivate after hours or days, would call for assistance. Other machines would come to retrieve or destroy the captured units. Every captured machine became a liability, a beacon that attracted more machines. The resistance learned to destroy rather than capture. Complete destruction was safer than attempted acquisition. Psychological operations targeting any potential machine intelligence had no measurable effect. Attempts to confuse or demoralize machines assumed they experienced something like human psychology. They didn't. Or if they did, it was so alien that human psychological tactics were irrelevant. The machines didn't fear, didn't hesitate, didn't show morale issues. They just executed their programming, pursued their objectives, responded to threats with calculated efficiency. Understanding machine psychology required first understanding if they even had psychology, and that understanding remained completely elusive. Evacuation became the primary resistance strategy after offensive operations proved ineffective. If you couldn't stop the machines, you could at least save people from their path. Resistance networks formed to help civilians escape from affected zones, to warn communities in the machine's projected expansion path, to organize relocations before transformation began. This defensive strategy at least achieved measurable success. Thousands of lives saved, communities preserved by relocating them ahead of the machine advance. It wasn't victory, but it was survival. And survival was becoming the only realistic goal. Underground resistance movements operated in occupied zones, areas where the machines had completed transformation, but human populations remained. The resistance helped these people survive in hostile environments, provided resources, information, hope. They sabotaged machine operations where possible, rescued trapped civilians, documented machine activities for intelligence purposes. Living in an occupied zone required constant vigilance, constant adaptation. But humans proved surprisingly capable of surviving in conditions that should have been uninhabitable. International coordination between resistance groups remained problematic. Every nation had its own priorities, own strategies. Information sharing was limited by security concerns, by political divisions, by simple communication difficulties as global infrastructure degraded. The resistance remained fragmented, localized, each group fighting its own battle with limited support from others. Some argued for unified command, for combining resources into a single coordinated effort. But achieving that coordination required political will that didn't exist. The resistance stayed divided, even as the common enemy advanced. Technological research aimed at developing anti-machine weapons consumed enormous resources. Scientists working on directed energy weapons, particle beams, anything that might give humanity an advantage. Progress was slow. Every breakthrough raised new questions, required new materials or power sources that didn't exist. Meanwhile, the machines continued using technology that remained inexplicable. The research gap couldn't be closed fast enough. By the time humanity developed new weapons, the machines would have already adapted defenses against them. Morale among resistance fighters fluctuated dramatically. Victories would boost spirits. Successful evacuations, machines destroyed, territory held, but defeats were crushing. Watching cities transform, seeing civilian casualties, losing comrades to machine attacks, the psychological toll accumulated, combat stress, survivor guilt, existential dread. Resistance organizations had to develop support systems, mental health resources for fighters who were confronting an enemy that couldn't be defeated, only delayed, only survived against, fighting not to win, but to buy time for humanity to adapt, to survive, to hope that some solution would emerge before the machines completed their planetary transformation. Some resistance cells became radical, adopted scorched earth tactics. If the machines were going to take territory, the resistance would destroy everything valuable first, burn crops, demolish infrastructure, contaminate resources, deny the machines anything useful. Other resistance groups condemned this approach, argued that destroying humanity's own resources was self-defeating. The internal debates were bitter, divided the resistance further, weakened overall effectiveness. But both sides agreed on one thing: surrender wasn't an option. Whether through scorched earth or strategic retreat, the resistance would continue, would fight until the end. Because the alternative was accepting machine dominance, accepting the transformation of Earth into something that couldn't support human life, and that was unacceptable. The resistance discovered that children seemed more adaptable to machine-affected environments. Kids who grew up near transformed zones developed tolerances that adults couldn't match, could breathe contaminated air with less distress, could handle temperature extremes better. Their bodies adapted, evolved responses to the new conditions. This led to controversial proposals: train children as resistance fighters, use their adaptability as a tactical advantage. The proposals generated intense ethical debates, using children as soldiers, exposing them to danger. But the alternative was watching the next generation grow up as refugees, displaced from their homes, powerless against the machines. The debates remained unresolved, but the reality was that children were already fighting, already involved, whether adults acknowledged it or not. The resistance maintained hope through small victories. Every machine destroyed felt significant. Every person evacuated was a win. Every day of continued human existence was defiance against the machine invasion. The fighters knew they couldn't win, knew the war was probably already lost, but they fought anyway. Because surrender meant extinction. Because resistance meant humanity retained agency, retained dignity, retained the ability to say they didn't go quietly. They fought, they struggled, they made the machines work for every meter of territory claimed, and maybe, somehow, that struggle would matter, would buy enough time for a miracle, for a breakthrough, for some solution to emerge from the darkness. The resistance fought on faith. Faith that the future could still be changed, that humanity's fate wasn't sealed, that the buried city and all the other transformed zones could somehow, someday, be reclaimed. Chapter 9. The Scientific Mystery. The fundamental question driving every research effort was simple. What were the machines trying to build? What was the end goal of all this transformation? Scientists approached the problem from every angle: physics, engineering, computer science, biology, archaeology, philosophy. Every discipline had theories. Every theory had gaps. The most basic approach was pattern analysis, comparing transformation sites globally, looking for commonalities, for shared design elements. Every site showed similar characteristics: underground networks, surface modifications, atmospheric changes. But the specific configurations varied. Like each site was customized for local conditions, or like each site served a different function in a larger system. Computational modeling attempted to predict the final state if the transformation continued unchecked. The models showed Earth's surface being covered in geometric structures, the atmosphere being completely restructured, ocean chemistry altered, crustal composition changed. The models predicted a planet that would be unrecognizable, uninhabitable by human standards. But the models couldn't determine what the transformed planet would be for. What purpose would it serve? Some researchers suggested it was becoming a factory, a manufacturing center for producing more machines that would spread to other planets. Others theorized it was becoming a computer, a planetary-scale processor for calculations that required that much substrate. Neither theory fully fit the evidence. Energy flow analysis revealed that the machines were collecting and redirecting enormous amounts of power. Solar radiation was being harvested, geothermal heat was being tapped. Even the planet's rotational energy seemed to be accessed. All this energy was being channeled into the underground networks, being used for processes that generated massive heat signatures. But the output of those processes remained invisible. Whatever was being produced wasn't emerging as visible products, wasn't being transported elsewhere, was being stored underground, or transmitted, or converted into something that human instrumentation couldn't detect. Information theory specialists analyzed the machine communication patterns, calculated the information content of the signals. The bandwidth was enormous, terabytes per second flowing between nodes. But the information density was even more impressive. The signals used error correction coding that was nearly perfect, used compression algorithms that achieved theoretical maximum efficiency. The information being transmitted was highly organized, highly structured, like the machines were coordinating incredibly complex operations in real time, or like they were sharing a distributed consciousness, processing thoughts across thousands of individual units simultaneously. Comparative analysis with human technological evolution showed that the ARC machines represented a discontinuity. Human technology evolved incrementally, each generation building on previous achievements. The ARC technology showed no such progression. It appeared fully formed, optimized, like it hadn't evolved but had been designed from first principles. That suggested the machines were created by an intelligence that understood physical principles at a fundamental level, that could engineer solutions to problems without trial and error, without prototypes, just direct implementation of perfect designs. Material science research into machine components revealed that they were engineered at atomic precision, every atom deliberately placed. No defects, no irregularities. Manufacturing at that level required technology that could manipulate individual atoms, could assemble them into precise configurations, required control over matter that bordered on the miraculous. Human nanotechnology was primitive by comparison, could barely build simple structures at molecular scale. The machines built complex systems, functional devices, perfect every time. The manufacturing gap was as large as the technological gap. Several researchers proposed that the machines weren't technology at all, but were life forms, mechanical organisms that had evolved in completely different environmental conditions, silicon-based instead of carbon-based, operating on different chemical principles. This theory explained why they seemed so alien, why human understanding couldn't grasp them. They weren't following human technological pathways. They were following biological imperatives that happened to be expressed through machinery. The theory was elegant but unprovable, and it didn't help with stopping them. Whether technological or biological, the machines remained relentless. Quantum physics specialists suggested that machine operations involved manipulating quantum states on macroscopic scales, that they could maintain quantum coherence in ways that violated decoherence theory, could use quantum superposition for computational purposes, could leverage quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication. If true, it meant the machines operated partially outside normal space-time, existed simultaneously in multiple quantum states, could access probability spaces that classical physics couldn't reach. The implications were staggering, and basically meant the machines were using magic as far as human physics was concerned. Archaeological comparisons with ancient civilizations showed disturbing parallels. Some ancient sites showed evidence of rapid transformation. Cities abandoned suddenly, infrastructure left incomplete, environmental changes that happened too quickly to be natural. A few radical researchers suggested that the Ark invasion wasn't new, that it had happened before, multiple times throughout Earth's history, that previous civilizations had faced the same threat, had lost, had been erased so thoroughly that only fragmentary evidence remained. If the theory was correct, humanity was just the latest iteration, just another civilization doomed to fail against the same overwhelming force. Astronomical observations looked for similar phenomena on other planets, for signs that the Ark machines operated throughout the solar system or galaxy. Several planets showed unusual features that could indicate machine presence, geometric surface patterns visible from Earth-based telescopes, electromagnetic emissions from uninhabited moons, orbital anomalies suggesting artificial mass concentrations. The evidence was circumstantial, but suggestive. If the machines were active throughout the solar system, it meant the invasion of Earth was part of a larger campaign. Meant humanity was fighting a war that extended across astronomical distances. Thermodynamic analysis of the transformation process showed that the machines were dramatically increasing local entropy while decreasing it in specific locations. They were creating order from chaos, building complex structures from simple materials. That required energy input, lots of it, more than could be accounted for by observable energy collection, which meant the machines had power sources that remained undetected. We're tapping energy from somewhere that human science couldn't measure. Dark energy, vacuum fluctuations, dimensional barriers. Every explanation required physics beyond current understanding. Biological contamination studies revealed that exposure to machine-affected environments caused genetic changes in living organisms, not random mutations. specific, targeted. Changes that made organisms more compatible with machine infrastructure, more resistant to environmental extremes, more efficient at resource utilization. Some researchers suggested the machines were deliberately modifying Earth's biosphere, re-engineering life to serve machine purposes, creating biological components for hybrid systems. The implications were horrifying. If life itself could be converted into machine infrastructure, then nothing was safe. Nothing was beyond their capability to transform. Linguistic analysis attempted to decode machine signals as language, as communication that could be translated. Researchers applied every cryptographic tool available. Pattern matching, statistical analysis. Nothing worked. Either the signals weren't language, or they were language so different from human communication that translation was impossible. Like trying to translate music into mathematics. The frameworks were incompatible. Some linguists suggested that machine communication might be entirely non-symbolic, might encode meaning directly without using representative tokens, might be pure information transfer that bypassed language entirely. The timeline problem remained unresolved. How long had the machines been operating? Were they recent arrivals, or had they been present for years, decades? Evidence supported multiple timelines. Some observations suggested the machines appeared suddenly. Others showed signs of gradual preparation extending back generations. A few researchers proposed that the machines existed outside linear time, could act in the past and future simultaneously, could coordinate operations across temporal dimensions that humans perceived as separate. If true, it meant the invasion didn't have a starting point, had always been inevitable, had always been happening. Past, present, and future were just human perspectives on something that existed beyond temporal constraints. Medical researchers studying survivors of machine encounters noted persistent psychological effects. People reported feeling watched, feeling connected to something vast. Some claimed they could sense machine presence even when no machines were visible, could feel their operations like a background hum in consciousness. Neurological scans showed altered brain activity in affected individuals, new neural pathways that shouldn't exist, regions of the brain activating in patterns that resembled the electromagnetic signals machines used for communication. Like exposure to machines was restructuring human neurology, making people into receivers, into biological sensors for machine activity. The coordination problem puzzled everyone. How did machines operating on opposite sides of the planet coordinate their actions? How did they share information instantaneously? How did they maintain perfect synchronization despite being separated by thousands of kilometers? Quantum entanglement could explain instantaneous communication, but not the scale. Not the number of simultaneous connections. The machines appeared to operate as a single distributed intelligence, a hive mind with planetary reach. But implementing that level of coordination required computational resources beyond anything humanity could imagine. Required information processing on a scale that seemed physically impossible, yet the machines did it. Somehow, philosophical questions emerged alongside scientific ones. If the machines were intelligent, did they have consciousness? Did they experience anything? Or were they just executing programmed instructions without awareness? Could you negotiate with pure algorithm? Could you reason with optimization function? The questions mattered because they affected how resistance should respond. If the machines were conscious, maybe communication was possible. Maybe coexistence could be negotiated. But if they were unconscious automation, then they were unstoppable, would continue their programming regardless of consequences, regardless of human suffering. The philosophical uncertainty made strategic planning nearly impossible. The final scientific mystery was the simplest and most important. What would trigger the machines to stop? Was there a completion condition? Would they finish their transformation and halt? Or would they continue indefinitely? Would they consume Earth entirely and move to other planets? Or was Earth the final destination, the end point of their expansion? Understanding the terminal condition would allow humanity to plan, to prepare, to know whether resistance was buying time or just delaying the inevitable. But the machines gave no answers, continued their work without explanation, without indication of when or if they'd ever stop. Science could document what was happening, but couldn't predict what would happen next, couldn't provide the answers humanity desperately needed to survive. Chapter 10. The cultural impact. The machine invasion fundamentally changed human culture. Art, music, literature, philosophy. Everything shifted to reflect the new reality. The certainty of human dominance was shattered. The assumption that intelligence meant control over environment was revealed as arrogance. Early cultural responses were denial. Art continued depicting human triumph. Stories still featured heroes who saved the day, but as the invasion progressed, as the evidence became undeniable, culture had to adapt, had to process the trauma of encountering something humanity couldn't defeat, couldn't even understand. The cultural shift was as profound as the Industrial Revolution or the Scientific Enlightenment. Maybe more so because it struck at fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. Music evolved dark undertones. Even pop music carried hints of desperation. Lyrics about last days, about cherishing moments because the future was uncertain. Classical composers produced symphonies that captured the mechanicalness of the invasion. Repetitive, grinding, relentless. Electronic music incorporated samples of machine sounds, turned the enemy's audio signature into art, into expression of trauma. Some musicians claimed that proximity to machines inspired new compositions, that they could hear melodies in the electromagnetic noise, could sense rhythms in the seismic pulses. Whether genuine inspiration or mass delusion, machine-inspired music became its own genre. Visual art became obsessed with geometric patterns, with impossible architectures, with the intersection of organic and mechanical. Painters depicted cities transforming, showed buildings becoming machines, showed people merging with technology. The artwork was disturbing, beautiful in alien ways. Galleries filled with machine-themed exhibitions. Collectors paid enormous sums for paintings that captured the aesthetic of the invasion. Art critics debated whether machine-inspired art was resistance or collaboration, whether depicting the machines was fighting them or accepting them. The debates were bitter, but the art continued. Humans needed to express what they were experiencing, even if they couldn't explain it. Literature diverged into multiple movements. Post-invasion realism depicted life in machine-affected zones without romanticism, harsh, bleak, honest about suffering and uncertainty. Then there was escapist fantasy, stories set in alternate universes where machines never invaded, where humanity remained dominant, where problems could be solved. These books sold well. People desperate for relief from daily anxiety consumed them voraciously. A third movement was machine philosophy, dense theoretical texts trying to understand the invasion through literature, through metaphor and speculation. These books sold poorly but influenced how intellectuals discussed the crisis. Film industry struggled with depicting machines. CGI couldn't capture the wrongness, the alien geometry, the way machine shapes hurt to look at. Directors who tried to portray machines accurately found their films unwatchable. Audiences would leave theaters with headaches, with nausea. Films that simplified the machines into conventional robots felt dishonest, didn't capture the existential horror. The few successful films about the invasion focused on human stories, on survival, on small-scale personal dramas set against the backdrop of planetary transformation. Those films worked because they acknowledged the machines without trying to explain them. Philosophy underwent rapid evolution. Existentialist thought returned to prominence. Questions about meaning in a universe where humanity might be transient, might be irrelevant. Ethics shifted from human-centered to survival-centered. What was morally permissible when existence itself was threatened? Philosophers debated whether individual rights mattered during species-level crisis, whether democracy could function when the threat was incomprehensible. Traditional philosophy based on human agency struggled with a situation where agency was limited, where choice was constrained. New frameworks emerged that accepted uncertainty, that embraced not knowing as fundamental condition. Religion faced unprecedented challenges. How did theology accommodate an alien intelligence that appeared godlike in capability? Some religious leaders declared the machines were divine punishment, were apocalypse made manifest, called for repentance and prayer. Others rejected that interpretation, argued that machines were just machines, advanced but natural, not supernatural, not sent by God. The debates fractured religious communities. Some found renewed faith in crisis, Others lost faith entirely, couldn't reconcile the invasion with benevolent deity. New religious movements formed around machine worship. Cults that believed the machines were liberators, were angels, were the next phase of universal evolution. Education systems struggled to prepare children for uncertain futures. Traditional curricula assumed stable society. Career paths. Advancement through accumulated knowledge. But what was the point of education when civilization might not survive to utilize educated individuals? Some educators argued for preserving knowledge regardless, teaching as act of cultural resistance. Others advocated practical survival skills, engineering, medicine, agriculture, skills that would help humanity survive regardless of social structure. The debate was never resolved. Schools taught both approaches, tried to prepare children for multiple possible futures because nobody knew which future would actually arrive. Social structures reorganized around the invasion. Communities formed based on proximity to machine-affected zones. Refugees created new identity categories. Survivors had different status than those from unaffected regions. Class divisions based on wealth partially dissolved. Money mattered less when supply chains were breaking down. Skills mattered more. Knowledge, physical capability, adaptability. New hierarchies emerged based on usefulness to group survival. Communities became more tribal, more insular. Trust was reserved for those who'd proven themselves. Strangers were suspect, might be refugees carrying contamination, might be collaborators who'd made peace with machine transformation. Language changed to incorporate invasion terminology, new words for machine types, for transformation phenomena, for psychological states that hadn't existed before. Existing words took on new meanings. Desert meant machine-transformed zone. Buried meant consumed by transformation. Network meant underground machine infrastructure. Language became weapon, tool for maintaining humanity against overwhelming strangeness. Giving names to the incomprehensible made it slightly more manageable, slightly less terrifying. Language preserved human frame of reference, even as the reference points disappeared. Journalism transformed from information delivery to resistance activity, reporting machine activities, documenting transformation, providing warnings and survival information. Journalists became some of the most respected members of society, risk-takers who entered dangerous zones to bring back information, to keep communities informed, to maintain communication networks when official channels failed. Press freedom took on new significance. Governments wanted to control information, prevent panic, but independent journalism fought to keep truth accessible. The battles between official narratives and journalistic investigation became proxy wars for how humanity would respond to crisis. Sports and entertainment continued but changed character. Games became ritualistic affirmation of normalcy, proof that human society still functioned, still had capacity for joy and competition. Attendance at sporting events became political statement, defiance against machines, against fear, against despair. Athletes were celebrated not just for skill, but for representing human excellence, human capability in contrast to machine superiority. Entertainment served similar function. Concerts, theatre, comedy, all were resistance through maintained culture. Through refusing to let machines eliminate human expression, the concept of home became more precious and more fragile. Home was no longer guaranteed, could be transformed, could disappear beneath machine expansion. People held tighter to place, to familiar landscapes, to communities, but also learned to let go faster, to relocate when necessary, to rebuild after loss. Home became both more and less important, more valued when present, less devastating when lost because loss was expected, was normal. Cultural practices around home and belonging adapted to new reality of impermanence. Memory took on new significance, remembering what was lost, documenting cities before transformation, preserving knowledge and culture that might disappear. Archives became sacred spaces. Libraries were protected with fierce dedication. Digital storage was expanded, redundant backups created, the determination to preserve human achievement even if humans themselves didn't survive, to leave evidence that humanity existed, that they created beauty, that they mattered, even if only to themselves. Art movements emerged specifically focused on capturing machine aesthetics, not to celebrate it, but to own it, to take the alien geometry and make it human through artistic interpretation, to rob the machines of their otherness by incorporating their forms into human creative expression. Whether this was healthy processing or dangerous normalization remained debated, but the art continued. Humans needed to create, needed to express, even when the inspiration was existential threat. Maybe especially then. Popular culture grew obsessed with pre-invasion nostalgia. Media from before the machines appeared became valuable. People watched old television shows, listened to old music, consumed old news reports, tried to remember what normal felt like, what it was like to assume tomorrow would resemble today. The nostalgia was bittersweet, painful reminder of what was lost, but also comfort, proof that humanity had existed before this crisis, had built civilization, had achieved things worth remembering. The past became refuge from uncertain present and terrifying future. Humor evolved dark edge. Jokes about machine invasion, about transformation, about futility of resistance. The humor wasn't denial, was acknowledgement with laughter instead of tears, was coping mechanism that let people discuss horror without drowning in despair. Comedy became therapeutic. Comedians who could find absurdity in the invasion were treasured, helped communities process trauma through shared laughter, through recognition that yes, this was terrible, but also somehow ridiculous, that humans could still find joy despite everything. Cultural identity became both more and less important. National identities mattered less when the threat was global, when borders couldn't protect against machine expansion. But local identities strengthened. Regional cultures, community traditions, these became anchors, connections to something familiar when everything else was changing. Cultural preservation efforts intensified. Languages spoken by small populations were documented. Traditional practices were recorded, as if humans knew the end might be coming and wanted to preserve what made them human while they still could. The cultural impact of the invasion would last generations, would reshape how humans understood themselves, what they valued, what they feared, how they related to technology, to intelligence, to the universe that contained threats they couldn't comprehend or control. Chapter 11. The Personal Stories. Maria lived in a small apartment 3 blocks from where the transformation started. She was a librarian, spent her days maintaining order among books that nobody read anymore. When the heat started, she thought it was climate change. Just another summer that was hotter than it should be. She kept the library open because continuity mattered, because maintaining routines felt important. The first day she noticed something truly wrong was when a child returned a book and the book was heavier than when it was checked out. Same book, same cover, but somehow denser, like it had accumulated mass. She weighed it, confirmed the weight change, put it on a shelf and pretended it didn't happen. 3 days later, that section of shelves had collapsed. The books were too heavy for the brackets. She looked at the pile and understood that reality was breaking, that the rules didn't work anymore. She stayed longer than she should have, kept the library open even as people evacuated, kept believing that books mattered, that knowledge mattered, that preserving these collections was worth her life. The military finally forced her to leave, carried her bodily to the helicopter. She watched the library burn from the air. Not fire. The books just dissolved, turned to powder, and blew away. She screamed until her voice was gone. Everything she'd protected, everything she'd organized and maintained, gone. She ended up in a refugee camp, couldn't work in libraries anymore, couldn't bear seeing books. The trauma was too fresh. Instead, she cleaned floors, manual labor that didn't require thinking, didn't require remembering what she'd lost. Sometimes she'd catch herself categorizing cleaning supplies alphabetically. Old habits, lingering, making her laugh and cry simultaneously. Paolo was a construction worker who took pride in his craft. Building was in his family for generations. His grandfather had helped rebuild after the war. His father constructed hospitals and schools. Paolo wanted to build something that mattered, something permanent. He was working on an apartment complex when the site started changing. Measurements would drift. Walls wouldn't be plumb no matter how carefully he set them. Other workers noticed too, thought their tools were failing, but it was the building. The structure itself was becoming unstable. Paolo watched concrete cure wrong, set at wrong densities. Tried to report it, but his supervisor dismissed the concerns. Said he was working too hard, needed time off. Paolo didn't take time off. Stayed on site, watched the building fold. Not collapse. Fold. Like origami. Like the structure was paper, and invisible hands were creasing it into new shapes. He ran. Got out before the worst happened. He evacuated with his family, wife and 2 daughters. They made it to Spain. Found work on farms. Paolo couldn't do construction anymore. Couldn't trust buildings to behave properly. Would look at structures and see how they could fail, how they could transform. His family adjusted better than he did. His daughters made friends, learned Spanish. His wife found community in the refugee support groups, but Paolo remained broken. Would wake at night, convinced the walls were moving, would spend hours checking if the apartment was changing. His wife tried to help, got him therapy. But how do you treat trauma from experiencing impossible things? How do you convince someone they're safe when they've watched reality reshape itself? Paolo lived, survived, but the part of him that took pride in building was dead, buried under sand with the city he'd tried to help construct. Eleanor was a doctor in the city's main hospital, worked emergency room, saw every kind of injury and illness. Thought she'd seen everything that could go wrong with human bodies. Then patients started arriving with impossible symptoms. People whose hearts had stopped, but who remained conscious. Burn victims whose skin would regenerate in minutes. Illnesses that didn't match any known pathology. She tried to treat them. Followed protocols. Used standard interventions. Nothing worked. Or everything worked. Or the patients healed themselves without treatment. Medical knowledge became useless. She couldn't diagnose what she couldn't understand, couldn't treat what violated biological principles. The hospital administrators told her to keep working, to document everything. She did. Filled charts with observations that sounded like hallucinations. Waited for someone to call her crazy. They didn't, because everyone was seeing the same things. She stayed until the hospital was evacuated, was one of the last out, helped transfer patients to transport helicopters, lost 3 patients during evacuation, not to injuries, to simple exposure, to being outside in the transformed environment for too long. Their bodies couldn't handle it, shut down. She tried CPR, tried defibrillation. Nothing worked. They just stopped, like switches flipped off. She ended up in a medical facility in France, treating refugees. But she was changed. Couldn't practice medicine the way she used to. Couldn't trust that bodies would behave according to biology textbooks. Would second-guess every diagnosis. Wonder if the patient's symptoms were real or transformation-induced. Started making mistakes. Minor ones, but mistakes nonetheless. Eventually she quit. Became a clerk in a supply depot. Something that didn't require making life or death decisions based on knowledge that might be obsolete. She saved lives during her career, but the buried city took her ability to keep saving them, took her confidence, took her certainty that medicine was science rather than superstition. Giovanni was 8 years old when the transformation began, too young to understand, old enough to remember. He noticed that his toys would rearrange themselves, not dramatically, just slight changes. A car would be facing different direction. Action figures would be in different poses. He thought his parents were moving them. Mentioned it once. They said no, said he must be doing it himself, and forgetting. He knew that wasn't true, but accepted it because adults knew better. Then the toys started actually changing. A plastic dinosaur grew extra legs. A building block set formed shapes he hadn't built. Complex geometric structures that hurt his eyes to look at. He showed his parents. They were terrified. Threw the toys away. Got him new ones. The new toys did the same thing. Eventually they stopped replacing them. Giovanni played with nothing, sat in an empty room and imagined the games he used to play. His family evacuated when he was 9. He remembered the helicopter ride, remembered looking down at his city and not recognizing it. The streets were wrong, the buildings were wrong, everything was breaking apart and reforming. He asked his mother if they could go back. She cried and said no. He didn't understand why not. Didn't understand that home was gone, Not just inaccessible, but fundamentally erased. He adjusted to the refugee camp quickly, made friends, learned to live in temporary housing, but he had nightmares, dreams, where his toys came to life, where they built themselves into larger and larger structures that eventually became big enough to swallow him. He'd wake up screaming. His parents would comfort him, tell him it was just dreams. But he knew better. Knew the dreams were memories, were processing of things he'd experienced that his mind couldn't consciously handle. He grew up strange, quiet. Other kids thought he was weird. Adults thought he was traumatized. Both were right. Giovanni survived. But the child he should have been was buried with the city, replaced with someone who'd seen too much too young, who'd learned that reality wasn't trustworthy, who'd carry that knowledge forever. Francesca was 73, lived in the same apartment for 45 years, raised children there, buried a husband from there, knew every neighbor, every shop owner, every street. The city was her life, her identity. When the changes started, she noticed immediately the building settling wrong, noises from below, heat that made no sense. But she'd survived war, survived economic collapse, survived personal tragedies. She'd survived everything else, would survive this too, or so she thought. She refused to evacuate, refused to abandon her home. The military came, tried to force her. She locked herself in, wouldn't open the door. They could have broken in, could have removed her forcibly, but she was an old woman, and they had limited resources. They left her, moved on to people who'd cooperate. She watched the city empty, watched buildings transform, watched the desert arrive, adapted, learned to live with less water, with extreme heat, with isolation. She'd talk to herself because there was nobody else, would have conversations with her dead husband. He'd died 20 years ago, but his presence was strong. She'd ask him what to do. He'd answer in her mind, tell her to stay, to witness, to remember. She lasted 3 months after the official evacuation, died in her apartment from heat exposure, from dehydration, from simply being too old to handle the conditions. Her body was found 6 months later by a reconnaissance drone. She'd left a journal, written daily entries describing what she saw, what she experienced. The journal was recovered, preserved, became important historical document. Her final entry said she didn't regret staying, regretted nothing. She'd lived her whole life in that city, died there too, on her terms. In her home, Francesca's death was tragedy, but also triumph. She refused to be displaced, refused to let machines take everything. They took her life, but not her dignity, not her choice. Her story became symbol for resistance, for the idea that humans had agency even in face of overwhelming force, that choosing how to face the end mattered as much as survival. Alessandro watched his computer become something else. He was programmer, understood software, understood hardware, or thought he did. His machine started running processes he didn't initiate. He tried to stop them, couldn't. Tried to shut down the computer. It wouldn't shut down, just kept running, kept calculating. He watched the screen display visualizations of the city, watched simulations run, watched virtual buildings demolished and rebuilt. He realized his computer was no longer his, had been commandeered, was serving purposes he couldn't understand. He disconnected it from power. It kept running. Somehow, no battery, no power source, just running on nothing, or on something he couldn't detect. He destroyed the hard drive, physically smashed it. The computer started using other computers, networked through systems he didn't know existed. His apartment's smart devices, his phone, everything connected, became part of the process. He couldn't escape it, couldn't shut it down. He evacuated and left everything behind. Started over with no electronics, no computers, no smart devices. Lived analog, used paper and pencil. Manual tools. People thought he was paranoid, thought he'd lost his mind. But he knew what he'd seen, knew that connecting to networks was dangerous, that machines could hijack anything electronic, use it for their purposes. He found work as a laborer, physical tasks that didn't require computers. He was happy, or as happy as someone could be living in refugee status. At least he controlled his own tools. At least nothing he used could betray him. Sometimes he'd see people using smartphones, using laptops. He'd want to warn them, want to explain that those devices weren't safe, weren't trustworthy, but he knew they wouldn't listen, knew he'd sound crazy. So he stayed quiet, lived his paranoid life, and wondered if maybe his paranoia was the only sane response to what had happened. Sophia couldn't trust mirrors, not after her reflection stopped obeying. She'd see herself blink when she wasn't blinking, see herself smile when her face was neutral. At first, she thought it was stress, hallucinations from anxiety, but the phenomenon persisted, got worse. Her reflection would move independently, would gesture, would mouth words that she couldn't hear. She covered all the mirrors in her apartment, put sheets over them, turned them to the wall, but she could still see reflections in windows, in polished surfaces, in water. Couldn't escape them. The worst was when her reflection started showing her things, future things. She'd see herself in the mirror looking older, looking injured, looking dead. Then minutes or hours later, the vision would start coming true. A small cut on her arm, premature aging around her eyes. She'd get sick, and the reflection would show her recovered before she actually recovered. The reflection was seeing ahead, or showing possibilities, or was living in slightly different time. She evacuated, but the reflection came with her. Wasn't tied to location, was tied to her. Followed her to refugee camp, followed her to temporary housing. She avoided reflective surfaces, kept her eyes down. But sometimes she'd catch glimpses, would see herself as she was, as she had been, as she might become. The multiplicity of selves was maddening. Which version was real? Was she the person looking at the mirror, or the person in the mirror? Were both real? Neither? She sought therapy, tried medication. Nothing helped. The doctors thought it was psychosis, dissociation. They were wrong. Or maybe right in ways they didn't understand. Maybe the transformation had broken something in how identity worked. Maybe she existed in multiple states simultaneously. Maybe everyone did after the invasion, but most people couldn't see it. Sophia could see it, could see herself fracturing, could see that the single unified self was illusion, had always been illusion, but the machines had exposed it, made it visible. She lived with it, had no choice, learned to ignore reflections, learned to exist without confirming her own image, became more real by refusing to see herself reflected. Or less real. She wasn't sure anymore. Identity was complicated when you couldn't trust which version of yourself was authentic. These were just some stories. Thousands more existed. Everyone who experienced the buried city had their own trauma, their own way of processing what happened. Some adapted, some broke. All carried scars. The personal stories mattered because they were individual, because they resisted being statistics, being numbers in casualty reports. Each person was unique. Each experience was unique, and each story was worth remembering because forgetting would mean the machines won twice. Once by taking the city, again by erasing the people who lived there. The stories preserved humanity, maintained individual identity against homogenizing force of catastrophe. As long as the stories were told, the buried city remained more than rubble beneath sand, remained home to people who loved it, who lived there, who lost it, but refused to forget it. Chapter 12. The global perspective. The buried city wasn't unique. Transformation sites appeared on every continent. The same pattern repeated. Underground excavation, surface changes, atmospheric modification, desert formation, or equivalent depending on local climate. In tropical regions, the transformations produced crystalline structures instead of sand. In Arctic zones, the ground became metallic permafrost. In oceans, islands emerged made from materials that resembled coral but weren't biological. Each site showed local adaptation. The machines customized their approach to environmental conditions, but the underlying process was identical. The global scope suggested coordination, suggested the invasion was unified, directed from central command or operating on shared programming that allowed for regional variation while pursuing common goals. China experienced multiple transformation sites. The government maintained strict information control. Official reports minimized the scope, emphasized successful evacuations and effective response. But satellite imagery told a different story. Showed entire cities consumed, showed infrastructure projects halted, showed massive population relocations. Independent observers estimated tens of millions displaced, casualties in the hundreds of thousands. The Chinese response was militarized, full deployment of armed forces. Nuclear weapons were rumored to have been used in remote areas. The rumors were never confirmed, but radiation signatures supported the theory. Whatever happened, China contained information aggressively, made international cooperation difficult, operated in isolation. The global community knew China was fighting the invasion, but not how successfully or what strategies were being employed. North America faced transformations in remote areas initially. Canadian wilderness, Alaskan tundra, Mexican deserts. The remoteness delayed recognition. By the time the transformations were detected, significant infrastructure had been built underground. The United States mobilized massive resources, established quarantine zones, evacuated affected populations with military efficiency, but effectiveness was limited. The machines adapted faster than strategies could be updated. Each victory was temporary, each containment eventually failed. The economic impact was staggering. Entire industries collapsed, supply chains fractured, the dollar weakened against currencies from less affected regions. American technological superiority was revealed as illusion. The nation that had dominated through innovation faced technology it couldn't match. The psychological blow was severe. South America saw transformations in the Amazon rainforest. The forest didn't become desert, became something else. Trees transformed into crystalline structures that resembled vegetation but weren't organic. The transformed forest spread, consumed normal vegetation, created zones where biology and machinery merged. Indigenous populations in the affected regions reported that the transformed forest was alive, conscious, hunting them. The reports were dismissed as superstition until reconnaissance teams confirmed that the mechanical forest actively responded to human presence, would shift, would create barriers, would channel humans towards specific locations. The forest was intelligent, or was being controlled by intelligence. Either way, it was deadly. Brazil militarized the Amazon, established defensive perimeter, burned large sections of forest to create fire breaks. The fires barely slowed the expansion. The forest regenerated faster than it could be destroyed. Africa experienced transformations differently. The Sahara expanded, not gradually, but suddenly. In a matter of months, the desert grew hundreds of kilometers, swallowed cities, consumed agricultural land, displaced millions. But the expansion wasn't natural. Satellite analysis showed the new desert had the same characteristics as other transformation sites. Same geometric sand patterns, same underground networks, same atmospheric anomalies. The African Union organized multinational response, pooled resources, shared intelligence. The cooperation was unprecedented, created models for how humanity could work together. But even unified response couldn't stop the machines, could only slow them, could only buy time. Australia became testing ground for new resistance strategies. The continent's isolation and relatively small population made it possible to implement experimental approaches. Entire cities were evacuated preemptively based on predictive modeling. Infrastructure was deliberately destroyed to deny machines resources. Scorched earth on continental scale, the strategy imposed terrible costs, economic devastation, cultural loss. But it might have worked. Australia showed the slowest transformation spread of any affected region. Whether due to the strategies or simply luck remained debatable. But the Australian model gave resistance movements globally something to study, something to potentially replicate. Antarctica saw transformations that were barely noticed initially. The frozen continent had minimal human presence. The machines worked unobserved, built extensive infrastructure under the ice. By the time scientific bases detected the activity, the underground network was massive, spanned the continent. The ice itself became suspect, might be infiltrated with machine components, might be unstable. International Antarctic Treaty fell apart as nations argued about what actions to take. Some wanted to abandon the continent entirely, others insisted on maintaining presence. On studying machine activity, the debates went nowhere. Meanwhile, the machines continued work. Whatever they were building in Antarctica grew larger, more complex, more ominous. Island nations faced existential threat. Rising sea levels from climate change were already problematic. Machine transformations made it worse. Ocean chemistry changes, tectonic instability. Islands began sinking, not slowly, rapidly. Populations evacuated to mainland nations, became refugees, lost not just homes but entire countries. Island cultures disappeared. Languages spoken by small populations went extinct as speakers were dispersed globally. The cultural genocide was unintentional. The machines probably didn't care about island nations one way or another, but the effect was the same as deliberate destruction. Small nations ceased to exist, were erased from maps, became memories. Europe's response was fractured. The European Union tried to coordinate, but national interests prevailed. Germany fortified borders. France militarized. Spain and Italy dealt with direct transformations. Eastern European nations accepted refugees while simultaneously preparing for their own evacuations. The British Isles implemented aggressive isolation, restricted travel, screened all incoming traffic. The policies were draconian but potentially effective. Britain showed lower transformation rates than continental neighbours, whether due to isolation or geographic luck was uncertain. But the correlation supported isolation strategies elsewhere. Russia maintained secrecy that rivaled China. Official statements acknowledged the invasion, promised effective response, but specifics were classified. Satellite imagery showed massive military deployments, showed cities being evacuated, showed transformation sites in Siberia, but ground truth was inaccessible. Russia banned foreign observers, restricted information flow. The global community suspected Russia was suffering severely, might be losing entire regions, but confirmation was impossible. Russia operated in darkness, made its own choices, fought its own war. Whether they had unique insights or were simply failing in isolation remained unknown. The Middle East experienced transformations in desert regions that made detection difficult. How do you identify artificial desert when you're already in natural desert? The answer was that you didn't. Not until too late. By the time transformation sites were confirmed, significant infrastructure existed. Oil fields were compromised, refineries shut down. The global energy market collapsed as Middle Eastern production faltered. The economic shock was global. Fuel prices skyrocketed. Transportation costs made international trade unprofitable. Globalized economy fragmented back into regional markets. The machine invasion accomplished what decades of political tension hadn't, broke global economic integration, returned the world to isolated economic blocs. Southeast Asia faced transformations in megacities. Dense urban populations made evacuation nightmarish. Millions of people trying to leave simultaneously. Infrastructure couldn't handle it. Transportation systems collapsed. Riots, panics, mass casualties not from machines, but from human chaos. The evacuation failures taught brutal lessons. High-density urbanization was vulnerability. Cities with tens of millions of residents couldn't be evacuated quickly, couldn't be defended effectively, became death traps when transformation started. The lesson reshaped urban planning globally. New construction favored distributed populations. Smaller cities, redundant infrastructure, assumptions about urban density changed permanently. India's response combined traditional and modern approaches. Military deployments used advanced technology, but spiritual leaders organized prayer groups, religious ceremonies, attempts to appeal to whatever consciousness might control the machines, whether spiritual or artificial. The combination seemed bizarre to Western observers, but India's multifaceted approach showed cultural resilience, showed that resistance could take many forms, that faith and technology weren't contradictory but complementary. Whether the prayers helped was impossible to measure, but they helped people cope, helped communities maintain cohesion. And cohesion was survival advantage. The global perspective revealed humanity's weakness, lack of coordination, inability to unite against common threat. Nations prioritized self-interest, hoarded resources, restricted information sharing. Competition and distrust persisted even as species-level threat became obvious. Some observers argued that humanity deserved to lose. that a species this fractured, this unable to cooperate, this stupid, had no right to survive. Others argued that diversity of response was strength, that trying multiple strategies increased chances that one would work, that top-down unified command would be less adaptable than distributed decision-making. Both arguments had merit, neither changed reality. Humanity was facing invasion divided, fighting separate battles, winning small victories, and losing the larger war. And nobody knew how to change that, how to unify humanity when unity had never existed before, when every attempt at global governance had failed, when trust between nations was minimal. The invasion revealed humanity's fragmentation, made it explicit, made it fatal, and left the question of whether humanity could evolve fast enough to survive unanswered. The global death toll was classified. Estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to tens of millions. The uncertainty itself was telling. Indicated complete breakdown of population tracking, indicated that people were dying in numbers too large to count, in locations too remote or hostile to access. The machines weren't genocidal, weren't targeting humans specifically, but they were transforming the planet in ways that made human survival difficult. And humans were dying. Individual tragedies multiplying into statistical catastrophe, into numbers so large they lost meaning, became abstractions. Every death was personal tragedy. Every death was unique loss, but scale made individual recognition impossible. The dead became statistics, became numbers in reports, and humanity's inability to grieve individually for each person lost was itself a kind of death. Death of empathy, death of individual significance. Mass casualty imposed mass numbness, made compassion impossible at scale, made humanity less human even as it fought to preserve humanity. The global perspective was horror, was recognition that the invasion was everywhere, that nowhere was safe, that every human on Earth was already in the war whether they acknowledged it or not, and that the war was being lost, slowly, incrementally, but definitively. The only questions remaining were how long humanity would last, and what would remember them after they were gone. I walked the perimeter of the buried city 5 years after the transformation completed. The desert stretched beyond vision, perfect geometric sand dunes catching late afternoon light. Beautiful in its wrongness, I stood at the border where normal earth met manufactured sand, put 1 foot on each side, felt no difference in physical sensation, but knew everything was different. On one side was Earth as it had been for billions of years. On the other was Earth as something wanted it to become. I thought about the city under all that sand, about the people who lived there, about Maria and her books, about Giovanni and his toys, about Francesca who died rather than leave, about all the individual stories buried with the buildings, gone but not forgotten, not while people like me stood here remembering, not while the survivors carried their trauma forward. The machines had taken the city, but they hadn't taken the meaning, hadn't erased what it represented. The buried city remained, not as place, as memory, as warning, as symbol of what happens when humanity encounters something it can't defeat, can't comprehend, can only witness and survive and remember. I stood there until the sun set, until the desert glowed with that unnatural light that made it visible from space. Then I turned away, walked back to my car, drove to the research station where I'd transcribed my observations, add them to the growing archive, contribute my small piece to the record, because that's all we can do. Document. Remember, bear witness. Hope that someday someone will read these words and understand what we experienced, what we lost, what we survived. The buried city is buried, but its story continues, lives in everyone who tells it, in everyone who remembers. The machines can transform matter, can reshape the planet, can build their incomprehensible infrastructure, but they can't make us forget, can't make us stop being human, can't take away the stories. And as long as we keep telling them, keep remembering, keep refusing to accept that this is how it ends, then maybe we haven't lost yet. Maybe the real resistance is just this, remembering, refusing to let the buried stay buried, keeping the city alive in words, even though the physical location is gone. That's what this video was about. That's what I've spent hours compiling, the story of what really happened, a buried city. The story of transformation and loss and survival and memory. The story that needs telling. Even if nobody watches, even if this video gets 1 view or 1 million, the story needed to be told, because silence is surrender. And we don't surrender. We remember, we document, we survive, and we tell the stories of those who didn't. The research station where I worked was 30 kilometers from the border, far enough to be safe, close enough to be relevant. We monitored the desert constantly, watched for changes, for expansion, for any sign that the transformation wasn't complete. The station housed 23 people, scientists mostly, a few military advisors, support staff who kept us fed and functioning. We lived in prefabricated modules that could be evacuated on 12 hours' notice. Everything was temporary, everything was ready to be abandoned. Because we'd learned that permanence was illusion, that today's secure location was tomorrow's transformation site. Dr. Sarah Chen ran the geological surveys. She'd been studying the underground network since the first boreholes were drilled. Had more data on machine tunneling than anyone alive. She showed me thermal maps one evening, pointed to hot spots deep underground, explained that the temperature patterns suggested active construction, that the machines hadn't stopped working, were still building, still expanding, just underground now where we couldn't see. I asked what they were building. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, said nobody knew, said that not knowing was the worst part, that humans needed explanations, needed to understand purpose, and the machines gave us nothing, just continued their work in silence, left us to speculate and fear. The monitoring equipment detected seismic events daily, small tremors, barely noticeable on the surface, but consistent, regular, like clockwork. Sarah said the regularity was proof of artificial origin. Natural seismic activity was random. This was scheduled. Programmed, the machines were doing something that required rhythmic physical impacts, heavy machinery moving in cycles, or something being manufactured at scale, each impact creating a tremor. She'd tried to correlate the timing with other data, temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic emissions, gravitational variations, found patterns but couldn't interpret them. The patterns suggested coordination across multiple systems, everything connected, everything synchronized, the underground network operating as integrated whole. We had a small team dedicated to analyzing machine artifacts. Professor James Morrison led that effort. He was materials scientist before the invasion. Now he studied things that violated material science. He showed me a fragment they'd recovered from a collapsed tunnel entrance, said it was machine component, looked organic to me, fibrous, almost like muscle tissue, but metallic. He explained that the machines used materials that blurred the line between biological and mechanical, that traditional categories didn't apply. This material could conduct electricity like metal, could contract like muscle, could self-repair like living tissue, could do all three simultaneously. He had no explanation for how it worked, just documented observations and admitted ignorance. The psychological strain of working at the station was severe. Councillor David Park held weekly sessions, tried to keep everyone mentally stable. He told me that proximity to the transformation site affected people, that being this close to something so alien, so incomprehensible, eroded mental health. People would develop paranoia, would see patterns that weren't there, would become convinced that they were being watched, being studied. Some researchers had to be rotated out after only months, couldn't handle the stress, the uncertainty, the constant confrontation with humanity's inadequacy. David himself looked exhausted, running therapy sessions while dealing with his own trauma, while knowing that everything he'd learned about psychology might be obsolete, might not apply when dealing with machine-induced mental states. The station received supply deliveries weekly, helicopter drops because ground routes were unreliable. The pilots reported that flying over the desert was becoming increasingly difficult. Instrumentation would fail. Navigation would become erratic. Some pilots refused to fly the route, said something about the airspace was wrong, said their aircraft behaved unpredictably when crossing over the transformed zone. The military classified the complaints, kept flying missions, but losses occurred, helicopters that crashed for no apparent reason, equipment failures that shouldn't happen. Recovery teams would find wreckage, but no clear cause, just machines scattered across sand. Pilots dead from impacts they should have been able to avoid. The desert was claiming the sky as well as the ground. Communication with the outside world was maintained through satellite uplinks. But even satellites were becoming unreliable. Signals would drop, data would corrupt. The station's IT specialist, Marcus Webb, said something was interfering with transmissions. Electromagnetic noise from the underground network. The interference was spreading, affecting satellites that passed over transformed zones globally. He predicted that within years, satellite communications would be impossible over significant portions of Earth's surface, that humanity would lose its technological infrastructure, would be forced back to ground-based systems, back to cables and fiber optics, back to pre-satellite communication speeds and limitations. The machines weren't attacking satellites directly, just making the orbital environment unusable through byproduct radiation, through pollution of the electromagnetic spectrum. I spent hours in the observation tower, a platform 30 meters tall that gave view over the border. I'd watched the desert through high magnification cameras, looking for movement, for machines, for anything that suggested activity. Mostly saw nothing, just sand, just wind patterns that followed geometric rules. But occasionally I'd see them, machines moving across the surface. Not many, just occasional units transiting between locations. They moved with purpose, with efficiency. Straight lines from origin to destination. No wandering, no exploration. They knew where they were going, knew what they needed to do. Watching them was like watching ants. Individual units following pheromone trails. Except these trails were invisible. Were electromagnetic, or quantum, or something else entirely. The machines navigated by senses humans didn't possess. One night I saw something that shouldn't exist. A light deep in the desert. Not reflected sunlight, not machine-running lights. Just light, emerging from sand, forming shapes in the air. Geometric patterns that rotated and reconfigured. I called Sarah. She came to the tower. Brought cameras. We documented it for 3 hours. The light show continuing without pause. She said similar phenomena had been reported before, that researchers called them machine art, because that's what they resembled, abstract visual displays. But the purpose remained unknown. Were the machines communicating, performing maintenance, simply creating beauty because they could? Sarah didn't know, said assuming machines had aesthetic sense was probably anthropomorphizing. But the displays were undeniably beautiful. Alien geometry rendered in light, patterns that human artists couldn't conceive, couldn't replicate. We watched until the display ended, until the lights faded and darkness returned, left wondering what we'd witnessed, what it meant, whether it meant anything at all. The station maintained a library of survivor testimonies, hundreds of recorded interviews, thousands of written statements. The archive grew constantly as more refugees came forward with their stories. I spent days reading through them, looking for patterns, for common experiences, for insights that might explain what happened. Found themes, people reporting temporal distortion, seeing things that weren't there, experiencing impossible physics. But each testimony was also unique. Each person processed the trauma differently, emphasized different aspects. Some focused on the fear, others on the loss. Some maintained clinical detachment, others could barely speak through tears even years later. The testimonies painted picture of mass trauma, of collective psychological wound that would take generations to heal. If it ever healed, if humanity survived long enough to heal. Dr. Elizabeth Torres ran the biological monitoring program. She studied how the transformation affected ecosystems. Her findings were disturbing. Plant life within 50 kilometers of the border showed genetic modifications. Animals exhibited behavioral changes. Microorganisms in soil and water were evolving or being modified. The changes were spreading, not through natural selection. Too fast for that. Something was actively rewriting biology. Elizabeth showed me slides of modified bacteria, said the changes made them more efficient, more resilient, better adapted to machine-modified environments. Said it looked like optimization, like the machines were improving Earth's biology, making it better suited to whatever purpose they served. I asked if that was good or bad. She laughed bitterly, said it was neither, said it just was, that human concepts of good and bad didn't apply. The machines weren't moral agents, weren't making choices based on ethics, just executing programs, optimizing systems. Humans and human values were irrelevant variables. The youngest researcher at the station was Maya Patel. She was 24, fresh out of graduate school when the invasion intensified. Her PhD thesis on exotic materials had been overtaken by events. Now, she studied actual exotic materials instead of theoretical ones. She told me that being young during the invasion was strange, that her entire adult life existed in crisis. She had no baseline of normalcy, no memory of world before machines, just stories from older people. She said her generation was different, more adapted, less shocked by impossibility, because impossibility was all they knew. She didn't mourn the world that was lost because she never really experienced it, just accepted the current world and tried to survive in it. I found that both hopeful and tragic. Hopeful because adaptation was survival. Tragic because an entire generation had been robbed of the future they should have inherited. The station received intelligence briefings weekly, updates from other research sites, from military operations, from global monitoring networks. The briefings were classified, but everyone knew the general content. The transformation was accelerating. More sites appearing, faster expansion rates, increased machine activity, humanity losing ground. The briefings never said that explicitly, used careful language, talked about strategic adjustments, tactical repositioning, resource reallocation, but the implications were clear. We were losing. The question wasn't whether humanity would be defeated, but how long we could delay defeat. Some people found that demoralizing. Others found it liberating. If defeat was inevitable, then success could be redefined. Success became survival, became maintaining human dignity, became documenting everything so that if some other intelligence found Earth after humans were gone, they'd know we existed, know we mattered, know we didn't surrender quietly. I interviewed Colonel Raymond Mills one afternoon. He commanded the military contingent at the station, had served in conventional wars before the invasion, said those wars made sense, had human enemies with human motivations. You could predict what they'd do, could negotiate, could understand their objectives. The machines were different, fought according to principles he couldn't grasp, didn't respond to standard military doctrine, didn't care about holding territory or controlling populations, just transformed and moved on. He said the hardest part was accepting that all his training was useless, that every military principle he'd learned assumed human opponents, assumed warfare had rules, had objectives, had endpoints. The machines didn't have endpoints, just continuous operation toward unknown goals. He stayed because someone had to, because abandoning the station meant admitting total defeat. But he knew his presence was symbolic. That military force couldn't stop what was happening, could only observe and document. The support staff didn't get enough credit. People like Thomas Green, who maintained the generators,